this is Andy Deer, who I also call you on the Sexyloops Andy the Redneck,
Yeah, that's it.
as you can see. And Andy's a rod builder on the Sexyloops, but we've known each other for quite some time now. Probably, I was trying to think about this.
I first
Yeah,
got on Sexyloops in 2004.
2004.
Yep.
I think we met earlier than that. When did I come across?
When you came through Texas to see Bill?
Yeah.
Well, I was we had just moved out to a little community north of San Antonio called Pipe Creek, and that would have been 2005, something like that.
All right. Okay.
I don't think it was any later than that. It's
When
been a long time, Paul.
Yeah, I see. We put up your your rod maker interviews, that series of
Yep.
interviews. I have a feeling that goes back prior prior to me going to the States.
So the first rod maker interview I did with Jimmy was in 2001. I
Okay.
believe it was the summer of 2001. And they cascaded pretty quickly after that. I think I was still doing the last one I did was with Gene Bullard, which I'm not sure if you guys published or not. He wasn't really a rod designer per se, but he lived in a little community just about 30 miles from me up the road. And that would have been 2006. I think the last one I did was probably around 2006. So it was certainly before 2006 that you and I met.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I know that. I can't remember if we used the articles prior to us meeting
That I don't remember, Paul. That's God, that's it's hard to believe that's been 22, 23 years ago.
because we must have met. It must have been 2000. Were you in this new place at 2004 or something like that? Because that's
No, it would have been early 2005.
okay.
Um, the earliest recollection I have with uh with interacting with you was I had a little casting game that I had sent over that you guys put up on the Sexy Loops website. It's still there actually. And I think it was Carlos Aspilaqueta
Mm.
maybe that put that up there. And he titled it, or you titled it, somebody called it Andy's Game. And it was this little casting game that I had designed for quick shots at redfish and saltwater. And I think it's still up on your website. That
Mm.
would have probably been 2004, somewhere thereabouts. I don't know. It may be date stamped on your website.
Yeah,
You may be able to
yeah. I'll have a look because I think we're
check some
older.
metadata or
I think
something.
we're older than we think we are, Andy.
No, I certainly feel like we are. You don't have nearly as much gray in your beard as I do, though. So
No, no, but I did have your haircut for a while there.
I know. Yeah, that's been a long time.
So where was it we actually met? I mean, when we actually met physically, which was that highway?
So we met on Interstate 10, just south of a little community called Seguin. And the irony of that is that that little casting get together that we had in 2024, where Rick came up and Bill came over, it was in Seguin, not probably 3 miles from where you and I stood on the side of the highway. And I still remember I had an old Lama Glass 7 weight, an 8 foot 6 7 weight that I still have out in the shop. And we cast that rod, and it seemed like you might have had a Sage XP, maybe. Seemed like
Almost,
that was sort of
almost certainly, yes. That would be
that.
the rod I was using.
I think that was sort of the rod of the day from
Yeah,
Sage back then.
yeah. I
I
may
do
have.
remember having the Lama Glass though.
Yeah, I remember that very, very clearly, like it was yesterday.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, that little area that we cast in was an area where the Texas Highway Department keeps asphalt and gravel to do road repair, and it's still there. That little area is still there with piles of asphalt and gravel. So the more things change, the more they stay the same, I guess.
Brilliant. So anyway, Andy, let's have a bit of a history about you. So maybe we can
Sure.
start off by actually how did you get into fly fishing? I imagine that was when you're growing up.
Well, fly fishing came along later for me. I mean, I did a lot of conventional fishing with spinning and casting gear for bass and redfish and speckled trout. Um, man, since I was probably old enough to walk. Fly fishing didn't actually enter into my atmosphere till about 1994. It was about maybe 2 years after I started building rods. And I can tell you exactly what sparked that in me because I really had no interest in fly fishing prior to that because I wasn't, we don't really have we do kind of now have a trout fishery down here. It's a put and take fishery in the Guadalupe that's just a
Mhm.
eighth of a mile from me here. But we didn't really have that kind of infrastructure around here to do what I consider to be proper fly fishing. Until one day, I stumbled across an episode of Flip Pallet on the Walker's Cay Chronicles. It was probably about 1994. And him and Chico Fernandez were fishing for redfish in the Indian River out of a 16-foot aluminum Monarch John boat. And I thought, golly, I can do that. Like they're fishing out of a 30-year-old, at the time, it was a 20-year-old boat, probably. And it was pretty primitive. I mean, it wasn't a bunch of proper trout fishermen, with thousands of dollars worth of gear. It was these two guys in a John boat in the middle of nowhere. And of course, we have a tremendous red fishery here. So I thought, boy, that's probably something I'd want to get into. The first fly rod that I actually bought, I didn't build. It was a Fenwick that I bought probably about 1994, 95, and used that until it broke. Um, but that's how I got into fly fishing was through the Walker's Cay Chronicles. And, um, some funny or ironic, maybe, I don't know if it's funny, but there's some ironic things that took place on a timeline after that. Um, I actually ended up corresponding with Flip some shortly before I graduated from college because he had been a banker in his previous life, and I had a history in banking when I was in college. That's what I did. And I still have this. I don't know how I found his email address in 1995. The internet was just sort of in its infancy, and I don't know how I stumbled across his email, but I managed to find his email, and I sent him this email and said, "Look, I'm getting ready to graduate from college. I'm working at a bank. You worked in a bank. You kind of made the jump to guiding. I have no idea what I'm going to do, but I don't want to be a banker. And my degree is in archaeology, and I didn't want to go and get a master's or a doctorate after that." And he came back and he said, "Don't be a guide. You'll go broke." Basically, that's what he said. I'll never forget. He said, "The pointy end of the boat is much better than the square end of the boat." And over the next, oh gosh, probably 20 years, I wouldn't say I corresponded with Flip a lot, but it was every 5 or 6 or 7 years, I'd reach out and say, "Hey, how you doing?"
Mm.
Just so you know, I kind of made the jump, and I ended up with a career in rod building, which will almost make you go broke as fast as being a guy. Being a guide will, maybe faster. But he was always very gracious, and I always felt a debt of gratitude to him for there's a whole culture that was spawned out of that show, the Walker's Cray Chronicles. In my mind, it's still the best fly fishing show that's ever been produced, and it's 26. It started in 91 thereabout. So, almost 35 years old, something like that.
Yeah.
I loved it because it was shot on film. It wasn't digital, and the folks that he had working for him were very talented cinematic videographers and audio video people, and so it has a very um, just a very cinematic feel to it. It doesn't feel like a soap opera like a lot
Yeah.
of fishing shows do. It's um, so
I
yeah,
think
that's how I got started was Walker's Cay.
everyone actually has a bit of a story to it. Actually, I think they're very well done
Yep,
because I think
it
I
was.
came in, I got into them because I think you posted some of them on the front page on
Hmm.
your pages, and then I went through and watched
Yeah,
all of them.
you know, back then, Paul, I wasn't quite as connected into the fly fishing community, and I'm really still not that connected. I sort of live out here in the middle of nowhere and try to just mind my own business. But back then, from what it looked like to me, there wasn't a lot of there wasn't the saltwater fly fishing community here in Texas like there was in Florida. Florida had a very rich history
Mm,
with saltwater fly fishing going back, to the 40s or the 50s. And we didn't really have that here that I could sense or see. Certainly there was some going on, but back then there was maybe only three or four guides that specialized in saltwater fly fishing. There were some that did crossover. Bill Shika would be a good example. He was known predominantly as a conventional fisherman for big trophy speckled trout, but he was a hell of a fly fisherman too.
mm,
Um, but we just didn't have that. In fact, I tell you, I can vividly remember this. I was out with an employer of mine, a former employer of mine that I used to fish with, and we were over in a little community called Aransas Pass, and kind of drifting across this flat, and he's up there with a conventional rod, and I'm with a fly rod, and I can hear these guys 100 yards away making fun of me, because it's like, look at that idiot over there with that effing fly rod. And now everybody wants to be the idiot with the effing fly rod down here in Texas. But we just didn't have that kind of acceptance over here back then.
yeah.
Most of the guys that did fly fish, like my good friend, the late Dr. John Tebbets, John had a house in Florida. Like he wasn't fishing here in Texas. I mean, he wanted to go chase, tarpon and permit and bonefish and barracuda and whatever else. And we don't really have that kind of fishery here. We have a really outstanding red fishery, and the speckled trout fishery is really good. It's unfortunate that they're so sensitive to freezes. About once every 6 or 8 or 10 years, we seem to have a bad freeze that kills a lot of fish. But there's a tarpon fishery to be taken advantage of, but it's mostly deeper water out in the Gulf of Mexico. Um, but we just don't. It just didn't attract enough people here. At least that's how it appeared to me. Maybe I was just on the fringes and didn't see that. But now it's hugely popular over here, and there's not a saltwater fishing magazine here in Texas that doesn't at some point in every issue have an issue have an article about saltwater in there.
I mean, I haven't been over there for a long time, but are the places now really busy in the sort? I mean, I imagine I get the impression there's a lot more people fishing and fly.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, Phil Blackmore and I talk about this all the time. Um, the problem that we have over here, and I'm probably going to make some enemies by saying this, although the people that I'm going to piss off are not the ones that are listening to this podcast, probably. But the problem that we have over here, and it's I would imagine it's the same way in Florida, is we have a whole culture over here of guys who are running 22 and 24-foot boats with tunnel hulls and 400 horsepower motors and towers, that are 6 or 8 or 10 feet that they can have an aerial view. And the fish just don't stand a chance. I mean, they just don't stand a chance. And the tournament fishing culture over here has become very popular, which is not something that I have ever had an interest in partaking in.
Mm,
But they just run over the fish, 80 miles an hour in 6 inches of water. And it's just not like it was. In fact, Phil and I were kind of lamenting, it was a couple of months ago. I said, Phil, I said, the fishing is not like it was in 2005. He said, Andy, it's not even like it was in 2020. I mean, it's tough. It's still good. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it's still good. And, Jack and I have managed to sort of, because we were talking about Flip and Chico fishing out of a 16-foot Monarch John boat. I managed to find that exact hull, not the one that they were fishing out of, but that exact model. About 5 years ago, there was a fellow over in East Texas selling one that was almost like brand new, and it was 30 years old. So I went and bought it just for the nostalgia of owning the same boat that inspired me to,
hmm,
to start fly fishing in the first place. And with my little boat, we can't really cross big water, but we can get into places where those people don't have much of an interest in going. Um,
mm,
we've moved our fishing sort of north of the more popular areas like Corpus Christi and Rockport, where there's a lot of clear water.
mm,
I fly fish quite a bit up around Port Lavaca now, which is muddier water,
mm.
which I enjoy because I used to fish Louisiana before that got really, really popular over there, and so it's just like fishing Louisiana for me. But it's still good. You just have to, you just have to pick your days, and if you can go during the week, so much the better. And if you have to fish on a weekend, try to do it on a weekend where there's not a tournament, or you're not, or
Yeah.
or go someplace where the tournament guys aren't going to go. But
I would imagine going in bad weather conditions would
yeah, you and I are both aware that um, being able to cast in the wind is a necessity if you're going to do salt water. But there still seems to be some guys that, the majority of the guys that I see fly fishing down here, they want it to be 10 miles an hour and calm. And it's like we get maybe one of those days a month. Here in Texas, it's pretty tough. Um, so it's imperative to me, that's why I practice so much, and that's why Phil practices so much, and Rick and
Yeah.
Bill and all the good people that that I know that are really good saltwater fly fishermen down here are guys that can deal with the wind. Um, I have no problem. What keeps me out of fishing in the wind is my boat. It's just not robust enough to go out in big water in weather like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's kind of how I got started in fly fishing was through Walker's Cay Chronicles, and it the obsession with the casting part of it and the rod building part of it has never waned for me. There was some short period of time after Jack was born for about 5 or 6 years that I was kind of away from that. But the minute that he was old enough to understand my history in the rod building business, and I mean, he was all about learning how to fish. In fact, the first time, let me see here, that would have been about 2014 or 15. I taught him how to cast. We went down to the river here. He broke the youth state record for carp on a 6 weight. And the
Right.
irony of all that is that we didn't really realize that there was a state record category for carp, so we just kind of let this big old fish go. And he's probably had 2 or 3 grand slams down at the coast on a fly rod. And so he enjoys it, I think, as much as I do. He's a little bit more of a fair weather fly fisherman. If it's blowing 20, he's going to have a spinning rod in his hand. But if I can see him in a 20-mile-an-hour wind, it's on with a fly. So
So you tell me about the history in the rod building then, because that was a big part of that was how you first got into the business, right?
it is, yeah, and that was sort of a happy accident. The back then again we were talking about that being the infancy of the internet. I was dating a girl for a couple of years there back in the early 90s, and back then the thing that you did on on a Friday or Saturday night if you weren't going out on a proper date with a girl, we would go rent movies on VHS tapes, maybe order a pizza and watch a couple of movies or something. And I remember I had I had done a lot of bass fishing through the 80s when I was a teenager. And then there was a little bit of a lull there between, maybe 18 and 22, where I was more involved socially with, dating and things like that. And then I just happened to get back into bass fishing, and I was looking for a very specific conventional bait casting rod that wasn't available on the open market. And I thought, I don't know how I'm going to find this rod. And it just so happened that one night we were at this video rental store, and there was a 2 cassette series there by a fellow named Dale Clemens, who all rod builders will know. And it was one of them was like Introduction to Rod Building, and then the other one I think was called like Decorative Rod Building Techniques. And I didn't rent that with the intention of learning how to build rods. I just thought it would be interesting to see how it was done. And so I rented these tapes, and it didn't look that difficult, to be honest. I thought, man, I could probably do that. So I remember before I bought any equipment or any rod blanks or anything, I used to sit in my apartment and I had a little wooden dowel, and I had bought some guides. And so I would practice wrapping guides on this wooden dowel just to see if it was something that I could do. And, it was easy. It was easy enough. And so that's kind of how it all started. I have a long history of building things, I guess I should say. When I was a teenager, I used to build electric guitars, and over the years have built golf clubs and firearms. And it's kind of funny because I'll get involved in something like music, and I was a fairly decent guitar player, but I never really wanted to be Eddie Van Halen. I wanted to be Paul Reed Smith. the guy who was building the stuff, and the same with golf clubs. I didn't want to be Ben Hogan. I wanted to be Gene Sheely, who was building his clubs. So whenever I get involved in a sport or something, I always seem to gravitate towards, well, how do we build this equipment? And so that's how I ended up in the rod building thing. And it just kind of snowballed, Paul. I mean, I started my first company in '97 with the intent of actually building rods for sale. And I did that for about, I'm going to say maybe about 3 years. And it was okay, but it's really hard to compete with big factory rod companies that can offer a certain type of warranty, or a certain type of price point. Back then, not a lot of people wanted to spend $300 or $400 on a rod to go chase redfish with. Now that's kind of the average. But so I did that for about 3 years, and I had some success with it, but I wasn't in love with it. I found that I was better at kind of through a series of happy accidents. I found that I was better at developing products for rod builders to use. And the first one would have been back then. That was sort of around the time that the advent of the imported mini lathe became popular. Prior to that, if you wanted a wood lathe to turn cork or wood reel seats or whatever, you were going to spend quite a bit of money. But Jet and Delta and a lot of these other tool companies started bringing in these mini lathes from China that you could get for a couple $100. And so now all of a sudden it opened up a whole new world for the rod builder to be able to turn their own cork grips,
Mm.
turn their own reel seats. But the problem was that it still didn't solve the issue. There's two ways that, not to get into the weeds of rod building here, but there's two ways that you can manufacture a grip for a fishing rod. You can glue the individual rings to the blank, but then you have to figure out a way to turn the whole blank.
Mhm.
And that presents an issue because, it opens the rod up to stresses being turned at high speed and potential for breakage. But also, if you mess up the shape or you get into some bad cork that you couldn't see, well, now you got to grind all that off the blank. So the other way you can do it is you can turn the grip off the blank on what's called a mandrel. And there was one place, Dale Clemens's tackle supply. He had these mandrels in his catalog that you could mount in a wood lathe. Had a little 60-degree recess in the end to fit the live center on the lathe. But they never had the doggone things in stock. And I tried to get those for about a year. And finally, I was working in a business park at the time. And there was a fellow that I had known that was a uh, really talented, what he calls himself, a prototype engineer. His name is Scott Wallace. And so my employer was kind enough to give me some office space up in the front of the building. And so sometimes I'd go up there at, 10 or 11 o'clock at night and work on rods. And Scott would be over at his shop. He's kind of a crazy guy. He was into unicycling, mountain unicycling of all things. And so I'd look out at midnight and Scott would be riding his unicycle around. And so I'd go out and chit chat with him. And he had actually been a customer of mine at the bank where I worked at when I was in college. So we knew each other. And, I'd say, what are you working on? And he'd be working on some crazy stuff. Like I remember one time he was building a carbon fiber luge that was going to be raced in the Olympics. And he'd say, what are you working on? And I'd say, well, I'm trying to figure out how the hell to make these mandrels. And he'd say, oh, that's no problem at all. Just come over to the shop. I'll show you how to do that. So he had the machinery over there to do it. And he showed me how to make these mandrels. And so I just started making these mandrels for me until it got out in the rod building community that I had these things and could make them at will. And that's kind of where the product development thing started, with those stupid sticks of steel that I always used to jokingly say you need a $2 piece of steel, but $1,000 machinist lathe to do it, to make them. And that's kind of how all that started. I started making custom reel seat inserts, for a lot of fly, REC, and back then Bellinger was still I think Bellinger might have come back under new ownership. Struble was still around back then, and so I started making seats for the skeleton hardware. Guys would buy the skeleton hardware, but if they had some real exotic piece of wood, they'd send it to me, and I'd manufacture the insert. And then that turned into making full-on wood grips and all kinds of decorative things, for rods. And that's when I kind of discovered, I really enjoy this a lot more than I do building rods. So um, that just kind of snowballed. I ended up in the epoxy end of the business in 2005. And we had Threadmaster and Threadmaster Light and Chromaseal color preserver along with some structural adhesives. That little business turned into, you know, um, I guess a fairly influential, little company. We introduced the very first foam core carbon fiber grips in 2006, which are hugely popular now. North Fork uses those on all of their rods, and I never expected it to be as, I guess, as have the the depth of a footprint that it did, but it
Mm,
did. And I had gone back to building some rods, not really for sale, but it was around that time in 2007 that I met Captain Freddie Lynch, who was one of the original fly fishing guides on the Texas coast. Back then, there was Freddie, and then there was Chuck Skates, who has been deceased for quite some time now. Um, there was Joe Mendez down in Corpus. There was only four or five of them down here that really were dedicated to the fly fishing game down here. And I got hooked up with Freddie just through a cold call, and ended up, it just so happened that he was fishing some tournaments with conventional gear with one of his fly fishing customers. And so I ended up building them casting and spinning rods for all their tournament pursuits. But I never really went back to building rods for sale after that. I just felt like that my talent was, I mean, I was a good rod builder, but I just enjoyed the product development thing
mm.
more. And it just seemed like that offered me more of an opportunity to leave my fingerprint on the industry than what, just building rods.
So yeah. I don't know the huge history of the epoxy. I know there's different generations. I've heard of Generation
Hmm.
4 and Generation 5, but I imagine there's Generation 1, 2, and 3.
No, there's not
No.
actually. No, so um, I'll tell you why I say that, why I named it that. So in 2005, I don't know how deep you want to go here into the rabbit hole, but decorative thread work in rod building has always been sort of the mark of a custom rod. Chevron wraps and diamond wraps and multi-layer weaves. I don't personally do that kind of work. Um, I have, but it sort of doesn't really fit my personality. But in order to but in order to properly do that, you have to have a product called a color preserver, which is usually a water-based acrylic that creates a barrier coat so that the epoxy doesn't discolor the thread when you put it on top. Gutebrod, who is the famous thread company, had a product back then called Gutebrod 811, and it was the best color preserver that had ever been on the market, bar none. And for whatever reason, they discontinued that somewhere around 2004. And I just thought one day, man, if I could find a replacement for that, it might be some money to be made here. And so I just started making cold calls to chemical companies and saying, here's who I am, here's what I do. And they would send me a sample, and 90% of them, 98% of them never worked. So one day I called up an epoxy company, and that I had been using some of their products to mount grips and reel seats onto rod blanks. And the owner just happened to answer the phone, and I told him who I was and what I was trying to do. And he said, we've been trying to break into the fishing rod business for like 10 years, but we don't know anything about it. And it sounds like you do. And I said, yeah, a little bit. And he said, well, let me transfer you over to our head chemist. You talk to him. So they transfer me over to John. His name was John. And John says, well, we've got this epoxy here that we developed. And back then, the big thing was UV resistance. The only really game in town was Flex Coat, which was nothing more than a bar, an indoor bar top coating. But it was the standard in the industry, and it was a really good finish, but it yellowed really quickly because it didn't have the proper types of UV inhibitors, to deal with outdoor use. And so John, he's trying to push this. He's saying, "Let me send you a sample of this epoxy." And I said, "No, no, no. Flex Coat's got that business wrapped up. I just need a color preserver." And so we finally kind of struck a deal where he said, well, I'll help you develop a color preserver if you'll sell our epoxy. So he sends me this sample, and I had to eat a little crow because I put some of that stuff on a white test sample, little aluminum test panel, put it up on my roof, and like 3 months later, it was still clear. So I had to call him back and go, uh, yeah, I think I want to sell your epoxy. And he said, it's really good. And I said, it's really good. So that's what became Threadmaster, which I think a lot of the original hot torpedoes had Threadmaster on them, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
I
that's
think
what.
Lee was using Threadmaster.
Yeah, Trevor and then Lee were both
Yeah.
using.
So I ended up I ended up selling that business to a fellow named Scott Parsons in 2008 for no other reason. Um, I've seen some stuff online about me where you guys have said, well, Andy made his money and he just wanted to get out. And it was like, no, man, I just had a kid and I wanted to be a dad, and I felt like I needed to have a little more of a stable income than the rod building thing provided. So I sold that business to Scott and I was kind of out of rod building and fishing for about 5 or 6 years. I still built a few rods for myself and for Jack, but having I didn't really have a presence in the industry. I mean, my friend Bill Faulkner always jokingly says that it's like I went into witness protection, with the FBI. Nobody could find me or knew where I was at. And that wasn't purposeful. It was just I was just being a dad, and being a husband and trying to develop a life around that. And when Jack started to, I remember he came to me and he said, I want to learn how to bass fish. And I was like, well, we ain't fishing with no factory rods. We're going to build some. So that's kind of how I got back into it about 2016. At the time, Paul, I had gotten into making custom knives and I had saw an opening in the knife business for a boutique dedicated epoxy that was formulated for the knife maker. Most of those guys were using just stuff that you could buy like at Home Depot or any of the big box hardware stores. And so I started this second company called Access Outdoors, and we released several products into the knife making market under the trade name of Blade Bond. And so I was selling Blade Bond and doing really well with it. Actually, I had a huge following in Australia, and it was very popular here in the States. And it was kind of funny because Scott Parsons, who had bought my company he had Threadmaster and all of that, he called me up about 2018 and he said, look, I kind of want to retire and I'm going to sell the company. Are you interested in buying it back? And I said, well, Scott, I'm already in the epoxy business and the knife making world. I don't really need to spend a bunch of money to get a guide wrap finish. I mean, I can formulate that pretty easy. And he said, well, I think you're, he said, I think you ought to come back into the fishing rod world, whether or not you come back with Threadmaster or something else. He said, there hasn't been a new guide wrap formula released in probably a decade. And I said, well, I'll think about it. So he ended up selling that company to Mudhole Tackle, now known as Foundation Outdoor Group. And I was talking to the chemist who had developed some of my knife making epoxies for me. I was using a different company than the people that made Threadmaster. And so they really didn't know my history. And so I called up there one day and said, hey, I used to formulate epoxies for the rod building world. And they went, man, we didn't even know that was like a viable thing. And I went, oh, there's millions of gallons of resin being sold in that industry. And they said, well, you interested in taking a shot at it? And I went, well, not unless we can come out with something that's, you know, a step up from Threadmaster, because that was sort of the standard at that point. The one thing that Threadmaster did really well was that it held its clarity for a long time, which was a huge monumental step over over Flex Coat and some of the others that had tried to come into the market. But they all suffered from one thing, which was a lack of bubble release, a lack of ability to release micro bubbles, and Threadmaster suffered from that too. Now it's pretty easy to get those out. You can do it with heat, with a little torch or a heat gun or whatever. And they do have what's called an anti defoaming agent. It's called a defoaming agent in that world. They do have a defoamer in there, but it only is so effective. I mean, if you introduce a bunch of bubbles in there, 50% of them might release. It's up to you to get the other 50% out, and you can do that with heat. So they sent me a sample of this formula that they had, and it was terrible, Paul. I mean, it was thick and it yellowed real badly. But the one thing it did really well is it had this amazing ability to release air, trapped air out of it. And so I called him back and said, look, this thing sucks, but it does this one thing really good, so let's start there and see where we go. So that's what we did. The reason that I called it Generation 4 was because if you look back over the history of rod building, there's sort of multiple generations of guide wrap finishes. Like you can start with what the guys used to use over silk, over bamboo, some kind of, one part urethane or varnish or something like that. And that would be the first generation. And then the second generation would be like the flex coats of the world, which were bar top coatings that Roger Siders, the genius that he is, figured out that that would make a hell of a good guide wrap coating, but it suffered in the UV department. Well, then Threadmaster came, and that was sort of the third generation of technology where we fixed the UV inhibitor part of it. And then the fourth generation would have been generation four, which is where we fixed the sort of air release part of it. So that's how I came up with the name was generation four. Um, Everybody always told me like Threadmaster is the best name for an epoxy. And I said, that was just one of them deals where I woke up in the middle of the night and it just popped in my head. I don't have those sort of moments of clarity anymore at 56 years old. So Generation 4 was the best I could come up with. But, we introduced Generation 4 in 2018. I ended up getting out of the knife making end of the epoxy business because COVID was awesome for the rod building world, but it wasn't for the knife making world for me because about 50% of my business was in Australia. And Australia had some of the harshest lockdowns, where it would take sometimes months to get product from the United States to Australia because they were so
Mm.
careful about, imports and exports and the possibility of the virus coming through. And so it wasn't, that the product wasn't well received. It's just COVID really kind of put a damper on that. And so, and at that same time, Generation 4, see, if it's kind of funny because I think back now and I think, man, if I'd have known what I knew then about the knife making business, I never would have got into that from the epoxy standpoint. Because when a guy makes a knife, he uses about 4 drops of epoxy. It's not enough to matter, so they buy like a 4 ounce kit and it lasts 3 years, whereas if I sell a rod builder a 4 ounce kit, well, that's gone after 2 rods and he's ready to buy again, so on a per project basis, there's a lot more resin being used in the rod building world than there was the knife making world. But thank God that I, was dumb enough to get into it because it led me back to the rod building world. And Generation 4 during COVID really took off because everybody was sitting at home building rods or they were going fishing, and it all worked out really good.
I mean, it was difficult enough for me to imagine that there's enough people out there building rods to have a viable epoxy business. But knife makers must be even fewer. How many people
Yes.
actually make knives for themselves?
I kind of hit that business at the right time because there was a reality show that was on the A&E channel here called Forged in Fire. And that Forged in Fire premiered probably around 2015. That was right around the time that I started selling epoxy into the knife making business. So there was this huge surge of people that watched that show and went, "That's awesome! I want to learn how to make a sword, or I want to learn how to make a knife." And I have to mention this guy. I haven't talked to him in probably 6 or 8 years, but he was hugely instrumental in helping me. His name was Walter Sorrells. And Walter is a knife maker, sword maker. I believe he's over in Atlanta, Georgia. And he has, bar none, the best YouTube channel that I have ever seen. He has hundreds of videos on knife making. But I'm telling you, these things look like they were produced by the people at the Discovery Channel. I mean, they're incredible. It's like he has his own studio and multiple cameras and sound equipment, and he's got to have somebody professional doing the editing. It's amazing how good his videos are. And I remember calling Walter and saying, "Look, I have this history in developing epoxies for the sporting goods industry, and I'm thinking about bringing something into the knife making world. Do you think this is a viable thing?" And he said, "Absolutely. Anything I can do to help, let me know." And that's one thing I've always been really fortunate at, Paul, is that I seem to have this weird cosmic ability to get a hold of the right person at the right time when I need them. And I can't tell you how many times that the universe has just aligned with my needs, and all of a sudden I'll bump into somebody and go, I'm thinking about developing this. And they go, well, I work in the cork business. I can help with that, and it's happened so many times. And sometimes I just have to laugh about it because it's like, I'm not really all that smart, but I do have the ability to connect with the right people. It's just like Scott riding his unicycle around at 1 in the morning. I mean,
Well,
I
like
needed to learn how to make mandrels. Scott said, well, I got a machinist lathe and I got some drill rod. Come over here. I'll show you how to do it. And 10 minutes later, literally, we had a set of mandrels and I was making grips. So that's sort of my talent is being able to connect with the right people that can make me look smart.
well, it's like when we had our blank stuck in customs and they were coming over. You phone them up, you get hold of this woman, and now you now you've got a
Well, some
direct
some of
link.
that is just some of that is getting a hold of somebody and saying, "Look, if I don't get my blanks, I'm coming down there and I'm beating everybody up." That works too. Oh, so yeah, that's sort of my history in rod building. I mean, anybody who's interested in that, I have a little bio on my website, that goes a little more in depth. I was very fortunate, to become really good friends with Tom Kirkman, who was the publisher of Rodmaker magazine.
Mm.
And at the time in the industry, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was kind of known as the wood lathe guy. And Tom was really into turning wood. He had a really nice lathe. And so Tom and I always jokingly say that Tom and I used to talk more during the day than I talked to my wife. I mean, sometimes we'd talk 2 or 3 times a day. And I remember telling Tom, you ought to put an article on Rodmaker on how to do grips and reel seats. He said, man, I got a backlog of articles. I don't really have the time for that, but if you want to take a stab at it, and I had never really written anything before, so I wrote this 2-part thing on how to turn grips and reel seats. And he came back and he said, God, this is fantastic. I mean, and it was really well received. I had a photographer friend of mine that I went to high school with he was a professional photographer that came out and took some really nice photos. And I still get feedback from people from time to time, even today, that say, that instructional DVD that you did on wood turning and those articles you did in Rod Maker, that's what got me turning grips and reel seats, which is great to hear that. I had a guy not too long ago. He said, you wouldn't have any reason to remember me, but I bought a set of mandrels from you in 2002, and I still use those things every week in my shop. And it's kind of cool because it's like in this day and age when stuff is so disposable and consumable, you make something that lasts 25 years. That's pretty good, I mean, it's kind of a neat thing. So, but I became really good friends with Tom. And when after those 2 articles ran in Rodmaker, he came back and he said, look, I'd love for you to do some more writing. And I said, well, my whole thing was that Rodmaker was and still is, for the most part, a how-to publication. How to do this, how to do that, how to manufacture this, how to use a lathe. And I really didn't want to do that. I kind of felt like that there was some more peripheral stuff to the craft that would mesh well with the how-to stuff and might be a little more entertaining. And so I came up with this idea that maybe we should try to find some of the old time rod designers that were still alive and maybe do some interviews with them. I'd kind of known Kerry not kind of, I knew Kerry Burkheimer fairly well at that point. I was buying some blanks from him, but Tom said, "Yeah, if you think you can find these guys." And I'll never forget. I went in my office and I did a quick search. I had had dinner with Gary Loomis about a year prior to that, and I asked Gary Loomis if Jimmy Green was still alive, and he said, "Yeah, he's living up on the Snake, up in Idaho," and it's just kind of a passing remark. So my first person that I wanted to interview was Jimmy Green. So I didn't even know if he was still alive. So I went in my office, typed in Jimmy Green Fenwick, came up Snake River Road. I was like, that's got to be the guy because I remembered Gary talking about him living on the Snake River. So I called him up and said, hey, man, I'm kind of trying to get this series of interviews off the ground. And he said, yeah, I'll help you out. And so I wouldn't say Jimmy and I were really good friends because he didn't live very long after I interviewed him, maybe a year and a half. But I used to call him about every 2 or 3 months, and we'd shoot the bull about casting. He autographed a book for me that he had written back in the 1960s.
Did
And
you interview him by phone or did you go up there?
no, by phone.
Uh-huh.
It was all by phone. Jimmy, when I knew him, he had emphysema real bad. So it was a little hard, he's a little bit laborious for him to talk and
Mm,
for extended periods, but he was very gracious and, always took my phone call and I'd ask him about casting a little bit. Mainly I just appreciated him so much because I didn't have any writing experience prior to that.
mm,
And I just appreciated him giving me the opportunity to interview him being a nobody. Hell, I'm still a nobody, but he was kind enough to do that. And after that, it was the neatest thing because everybody that I called never, I never had anybody say, no, I'm not interested in that. And I ended up interviewing Tom Morgan and Kerry Burkheimer, of course, Press Powell, who was a great guy. I became pretty good friends with Press. He was another one that when I interviewed him, he had cancer and he didn't live but about another year after that. Um, a lot of people don't know Dick Cantner, but Dick Cantner was hugely influential. In fact, there's an argument to be made that Dick Cantner actually developed the first carbon fiber fly rod before Fenwick did. But Fenwick had the marketing budget, to bring it to fruition and let the public know about it. And Dick didn't really have that. But Dick was a super interesting guy. He had worked on military black operations programs. He built the titanium skin gas tanks for the Lockheed A-12 spy plane back in the 60s.
mm,
And after that, he started a company that built the first carbon fiber bows and arrows, the first carbon fiber tennis rackets, and ultimately got into fishing rods with a company called Graphite USA, and then opened a sister company over in New Zealand called Composite Developments with Marty Johansson. And so I knew Dick really well. All of those guys got to become friends. I interviewed Roger Siders from Flexcoat. He still lives right up the road from me here, about 80 miles up the road from me here in Austin. But I've had people ask me before, what do you feel like is probably the most important thing that you've accomplished in rod building? All the product development stuff, awesome. But most of those people that I interviewed are not around anymore.
mm,
Tom Morgan passed away about 5 or 6 years ago. I've been in touch with his wife, Jerry, some, but to my knowledge, there wasn't a whole lot of. Tom Dorsey from Thomas and Thomas was another one. I think he's still around, but Tom has got to be in his 80s now too.
mm,
And I talked to Kerry Burkheimer a few months ago. I hadn't talked to Kerry in a really long time, but he seems to be doing well, and they're still building a ton of rods up there in
mm,
Washington. Um, but I feel like those stories were important to get down on paper because like Jimmy died within 18 months after I interviewed him, and Press died within a year after I interviewed him.
mm.
Um, and to my knowledge, there weren't any more, um, you know, interviews with those guys after I interviewed them. So that was sort of their last chance to get things down, to get their story out there in the public eye. And Rodmaker was the perfect platform to do that. And Tom was, it's just kind of like, hey man, do whatever you do whatever you want. He never edited anything, he never changed anything. He published it exactly the way I wrote it, and I wrote it exactly the way that those guys said it to me. I used to have a little tape recorder, and I'd sit there, and this was before voice recognition software, any of that, and I'd listen to the interview and type every word out, as exactly as they had said it. So, um, I feel very fortunate to have been able to do that. The product development stuff always came easy to me, but the writing thing was so far out of my wheelhouse. And,
Do you still
I
have
mean, I
those?
guess
Still have those recordings?
I do actually. They're on cassette tape. I don't know. I've thought about having them transferred over to digital.
Mm,
They're in the back room back there. In fact, I'll tell you some interesting stuff. Um, about 6 months after I did that interview with Jimmy, and I wrote about this on a front page, I got a package from Japan in the mail one day. And I thought, I don't know anybody in Japan. I don't know what this is, but I opened it up and it was a copy of a magazine I think it's called Fly Rodder. And it was a Japanese publication. And there was a guy in there that he had done an interview with Jimmy. His name was Hiroyasu Obana. And Hiroyasu had gone to school over here in the States, maybe in Montana. if I'm not mistaken. And he had gone over and spent like a week or two with Jimmy and his wife Carol casting because Jimmy had this awesome pond in his backyard, And so I guess Hero had read my article on Rodmaker, and he sent me this magazine. It's all in Japanese, so I can't read it. And the funny thing about that is I completely forgot that I had that magazine until about 5 or 6 years ago. I was going through some boxes and I found this magazine and I found Hiroyasu on Facebook. And so we're big friends now. He's in fact, I'm still trying to get him to translate that interview because I'd love to read it. But yeah, Tom, Rodmaker was I was very fortunate to that Tom was so gracious to allow me to do that because that was something I had no idea that I was halfway decent at. But again, it was just, having the fortitude to call somebody up and go, "Hey, you want to do an interview?" I don't really have that much experience, but I write for Rodmaker, and every one of them was always super excited about it and always said yes. I really would like to have interviewed Jerry from Sage and um, Jim from Scott, but my tenure with Rodmaker ended. When I sold my business, I kind of, you know, extracted myself out of the rod building world for a few years. But those guys are still around, and their stories have been well documented. With the advent of YouTube and the podcast and everything. So I kind of feel like the important work that needed to be done back in 2000, 2001 was done because that back then, literary publications were the platform that everybody used. And now, print is kind of dead, as they say, in some ways. So, but yeah, all of those are on your website. I think you've got all of them on your website.
I have to check. There may be one missing from that.
Yeah, I need to go look and see.
Yeah,
I need to go
they
look and
they
see.
need. I was think I read them all recently. Actually, well, in the last year, I went back through them for some and yeah, we need to edit it. See, this is why I think it's quite old because the formatting is it's on the obviously on the
It's
original
re-
site, but the
yeah,
formatting is terrible,
it's
and
terrible.
that's my
Yeah.
fault. But
Well, and I did those transcriptions in like Microsoft Word 1997 or something, So it's,
we just piled him in because that was an HTML, and I that's why I think that's why I think it was earlier
it might have
because
been.
I suspect that was, I mean, it must have been before we met, right? In person.
I'd be lying if I told you I remembered, Paul. The neat thing about that is that before Press Pal passed away, Press sent me a bunch of, I guess one might call it memorabilia, family memorabilia. And I think Press knew that he was not going to be around for much longer. So he sent me some really neat stuff, historical stuff. And
Mm.
he said, just keep it. It's yours if you want it, just keep it. And I've got a little booklet that his grandfather wrote on fly fishing, and it's signed by his grandfather, his father, and him. Walton Powell
Yeah.
was the one who kind of put fiberglass rods, Powell rods on the map. Um, he sent me some really neat newspaper clippings that maybe some point in the next podcast we can explore. But there's a really neat newspaper clipping in there about the guy who was the first guy to use the double hull in a competition. And I want to say his name was Jack Sparks, but I'd have to go back there and grab that and see. Anyway, it was just neat historical stuff like that he didn't
When
want any
was that? 1920s?
something like that. Yeah, it was a long time ago. It was a long time ago. Um, I'll try. When we get done with this one and we do the next podcast,
Yeah, that would be very interesting.
yeah, yeah. But I mean, I have really neat pictures of Press and his dad, in the shop, and um, I have a lot of pictures of Kerry Burkheimer's shop. Of course, I don't know that Kerry's in the same building as he was 25 years ago when we did these interviews, but I would send, like with Kerry, I sent Kerry a disposable camera and just said, "Hey, take a bunch of pictures in your shop, and then I'll have it developed." And he sent it back down, and I went and had them developed. And so I've got, I did a lot of distribution for All Star Composites. You and I have had conversations about the All Star Austin fly rods that Bill Gammel had a hand in developing, and I probably got 200 or 300 pictures of the inside of the All Star factory back there because I did distribution for them for about 8 years, 7 years, and as another one, it was just a happy accident that Sharon Johnson had become a moderator. She had become a sponsor on Tom Kirkman's rodbuilding.org forum. This is long before social media. And I happened to be a moderator on that forum, and so I extended Sharon a welcome, and I said, "Look, I'm over in San Antonio, just a couple hundred miles east of you." And she said, "Well, if you ever make it over this way, I'll give you a factory tour." And it just so happened I had just met my future wife, Emily, who was from Houston, and she had invited me to go to a wedding for a friend of hers, and I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to go over to All Star. I didn't mean to derail the conversation to a different subject, but we're talking about documentation of history here. And so I went over and met Sharon and Mike Welsh, and they gave me a tour of the factory. And they were having, they had this line of fly rods that had originally been developed, I think, by Tim Grennan, who used to work for Fenwick. And I guess for the day the technology was what it was, but they were heavy and they were not not great. Not terrible, but not great. And then they had hired Don Moak, who had worked for Gary Loomis at LCI, and that's when Don commandeered Bill Gammel to come over and help do the product development. And they said, "Look, we're having a really hard time marketing these fly rods." And I straight up told him, I said, "Look, there's no self-respecting fly fisherman's ever going to buy a fly rod from a bass rod company. But I think we could sell a pile of these blanks to the rod builders." And they said, "Well, let's start there." So I was the one who kind of put the Austins on the map in the rod building world. They became hugely popular. Unfortunately, shortly after that, All Star got bought out by Shakespeare, and that factory ended up closing down in 2007. Or I think they might have had a shot at, the original plan that Mike Welsh told me was that they were going to remarket those Austins under the Pfluger name, that Shakespeare had plans to remarket those tapers under the Pfluger name, and I don't think that ever went anywhere.
Hmm.
But I've got some really neat, photographs of the inside of that factory that was over on Telge Road over there in Houston. And it's hard to believe that was 20 years ago. I still keep in touch with Mike. When Shakespeare bought them out, he was the only employee that went to South Carolina. Everybody else just went and found another job. But Mike went to South Carolina, and he's had a hell of a career with pure fishing out there. He's still with them. I kept in touch with Sharon for a long time. Unfortunately, she passed away from complications from a stroke about 2 or 3 years ago, something like that. But that was another situation where it was just dumb luck that I happened to be in Houston for a wedding and went over there and ended up doing distribution for them for a long time. Um, I've
I,
still
I,
got a bunch of those Austin
I
blanks, but
I did a little bit of work with Shakespeare at one point in testing some rods when I sort of just before Sexyloops actually. And what I found interesting about that company is it's also owned, or it's under the brand of K2, who make these incredible top quality skis.
yep,
So they're right at the up top end of the market in terms of
yep.
skis, but in terms of fishing, they're really in at the budget end, as cheap
You
as you can
know,
possibly be.
that company, I think, is owned by like a private equity or venture capital. They, for a while, and I haven't looked at this in a long time, but for a while, it was like that group of companies. It was like Shakespeare, Pfluger, Berkeley, Abu Garcia, Hoover Vacuum Cleaners, Mr. Coffee Makers. It was like it was like those guys. They just pooled their money together and went around and bought companies that were struggling, and then brought
Yeah,
them
I
back
think
to
I
life.
no, I think
You know,
I must have been before that. This would have been in the
probably mid '90s or something.
yeah,
Or
yeah, about 95,
yeah,
96,
yeah,
97
yeah.
maybe. Um, oh, absolutely fascinating. Let me let's go pick up
Well,
another.
it's certainly an eclectic career path. I mean, that's how I describe my involvement in the rock
Who's
building world.
Fluger? That was that under Shakespeare then? Or was that a
Still is, yeah,
well,
yeah, still is.
was it originally under Shakespeare?
I think all of those companies at one point were independently owned, but
I
then
think my
got
first
bought
rod
up.
was a fiberglass Fluger or Fledger, as I
Mm-hmm.
thought it was called at that point.
Fledger. That's what we're going to call it from now on. Sort of like Rod pants instead of Rod socks.
Well, Fenwick is actually Fenwick in English. Without
Oh, okay.
we dropped the W.
Yeah.
Like
They're
so,
they're under that umbrella also. Fenwick, Pfluger, Abu Garcia, um, Shakespeare, Berkeley, they're all, and Fenwick
they
is owned by them too.
right. Okay, now there was
Yeah, now, yeah,
yeah,
not back then, but
yeah, no, there was certainly been there was a big push to get a lot of where they did seem to grab a whole bunch of companies, but also Bank have done the same.
yeah, yeah, correct. Jimmy Green told me that what happened with Fenwick, and it's kind of good the way it happened because we wouldn't have Sage if Fenwick hadn't have sold out to Woodstream, is what Jimmy told me. But Jimmy, Jimmy did a lot of pioneering work with fly lines. In fact, he told me, he said, I did more innovative work with fly lines than I ever did with fishing rods.
Mm,
Um, but he worked for, I think it was the Sunset Line and Twine Company that they made some of the first PVC coated fly lines, if I'm not mistaken. But when he was working for Fenwick, they had a company originally that was making a bunch of their blanks called the Grizzly Rod Company. And Grizzly was owned by Don Green. And then I don't, the details are foggy to me right now, but somehow, I don't know if Fenwick bought the Grizzly company, but somehow Don came to work at Fenwick, and then there's no relation there. Don Green and Jimmy Green, they're not cousins or brothers or anything, just happen to have the same last name. But Don had the blank making expertise, and Jimmy had the casting expertise. And so when they got Don over there, that's when they started making all of the really famous fiberglass fly rod blanks back in the 60s. And then, of course, when carbon fiber came on the scene, Fenwick was the one who had the first HMG. I think it was called a HMG. And Jimmy told me, he said, I was the one who taught Don how to fly cast. Well, when Fenwick sold out to Woodstream in the early 80s, Don didn't stick around very long and he left and went and started Sage. And that's how Sage came about, was when Don left Fenwick, he went and started Sage. Jimmy stayed on at Fenwick for about another 5 or 6 years, but he said, it wasn't even the same company that it was when Phil Klock and his family owned Fenwick. It was a different thing.
mm,
And so I think he stayed on as an advisor and then he left. And then Jimmy actually, I don't know that Jimmy actually ever worked at Sage proper, but he certainly was like an advisor, like a technical advisor.
mm.
Um, but I hated to see Fenwick. I mean, and I was, like in my late teens, early 20s when that happened, but I had Fenwick rods, and not fly rods, but spinning rods and casting rods. And
They were a big name.
it was a hugely influential
High quality.
company. Yeah, no, they invented the tip over butt ferrule. Jimmy invented the tip over butt ferrule, because everybody prior to that was using metals, the metal
Yeah.
ferrules, and he was the one who who
Mm.
who developed that. But anyway,
When was the first carbon fiber rod?
early 70s, I want to say 71 or 72 or thereabouts. And that was the original, what they call industry standard material. It's a 33 million modulus material. What we would consider today very basic stuff,
Yeah.
but back then it was, um, and that leads into a discussion. I'm looking at my outline here that you and we talked about not too long ago. I mean, I think you have very strong thoughts about how rods have gotten too stiff and too fast, and that a
Mm.
lot of the older tapers are much more of a pleasure to cast and fish with.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, and supporting this with some evidence is fly lines have gotten heavier than
Yep.
standard. So if
Yep.
so most people are really struggling with the rods they've got, and so they're using heavier lines, but the lines that are even heavier than they should be to begin with. So
Yep.
obviously rods have got too soft. But that kind of happened. I mean, that probably happened in around. I reckon when the TCR was the first one, right? For me, I mean,
Do you,
it wasn't for them because they had the SP Plus, didn't they? They had some very stiff rods, but there was a big move there around mid to mid 90s.
yeah, I would say, I mean, I wasn't an astute enough caster at that point to be able to tell the difference from anything. But I remember my Fenwick that I had, and then the first time I cast a GLX, I was like, well, this is a completely different game here.
Mm.
um, but I when I kind of cut my teeth in that world, starting in the mid '90s, uh, the let's see here, the Sage, was it the RPL? I think was still maybe in their quiver. Um, the GLX was around about that time. That was sort of that was the game changer. I feel like was the GLX in terms of weight,
Oh,
stiffness to
sorry.
weight.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. The the stage rods I'm talking about were actually in the
Oh, okay, Sage.
were
Sorry,
were,
I was
were
I was
were later than that, weren't they? They were in the early 2000s.
yes,
That's
yeah,
when they became
yeah,
stiffer. I'm getting.
yes,
We're getting old here, Andy,
yeah,
and
and
mixing up our
and I would say
decades.
and I would say Scott the same way. Because my favorite rod still to this day, if we're talking about factory rods, is a Scott Heliply.
Okay.
It's an eight
Yeah.
foot eight and 8 foot eight 3-piece rod. Um, and I've got three of them out there in the shop that I still mess with occasionally. But comparatively speaking, they're extremely soft. They didn't
Okay.
feel like it in 1997. They didn't feel like it. But
Yeah. So but I would say probably the state of art rod, probably the best rod I've cast uh it and fished with in the history in my history from back then um was a Loomis IMX, and this
hmm
would be about 91, 92.
yep,
Get my years right
yep,
now. And I had a couple of those when I went to New Zealand, and I used that for a long time. And it wasn't that it was necessarily overall softer. It's basically that the lower half had bend.
yep,
Whereas the stiff rod now, yeah, they bend, but they don't bend very much. And so you are in effect casting you've got this rigid lower section, and then you've got this bendy tip. And that seems to be how most people associate fast rods with. And
yep,
I don't know if it's marketing. There's one of two things it could be. It's either marketing, that people have heard that good casters or expert casters like fast rods, because it was actually said, had that marking. It says you've
yep.
got to be a really good caster to have this rod, and people go, "Oh, I'm a really good caster," and it
Right,
turns out they're not. But but
right,
but the other point is actually really good casters don't like or rarely like really stiff
right.
rods. That's one. But the other possibility that I think of is this all happened a similar time as a lifetime guarantee. And it's also possible that rods went over to so that they didn't have the 10% return rate,
Yeah,
or
yep.
because I think in the lifetime of a rod, most of them break, right? Especially, after 10, people who actually take the rods fishing, and actually go out regularly over a period of time, it's likely that they're going to break a
Oh
section
yeah,
here or there.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
that's just what happens. And so,
yep,
and if you've got a lifetime guarantee, and particularly those early lifetime guarantees, which were in some cases we will give you a new rod, that's that's
yep.
unsustainable over a period of time. So I think I did notice that the change sort of happened around then. But whatever it is, it's stuck. And
Yeah, I think your timeline is right, Paul. And I would say, I noticed the same thing. The same thing happened in golf around the exact same time.
hmm,
And what happened in golf, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that was a shot maker's game. They used a soft wound ball with a balata cover on it that was only good for about 4 or 5 holes before it would go out around, but you could shape it because it was soft and it was rubbery and you could make it spin. And, in 1980, the average drive on the PGA Tour was probably about 265 yards. Well, sometime in the early 90s, that changed. They went from a wound ball to a solid core ball, which flew straighter. That's why they did it that way, because the average golfer couldn't hardly break 80 because that wound ball spun so much. And if you hit it just 1 degree off the center of the face, it was going off the planet, man. And so they went to a solid core ball with a different dimple pattern, which flew straighter and it flew further. And so it gave the average golfer that was a 15 handicap, they could go out and enjoy the game a little bit more. And then Tiger switched to a solid core ball. All of a sudden, we got ping with cavity back irons, and perimeter weighting, which allows for straighter shots. It just changed. It wasn't a shot maker's game anymore. It was all about what we used to call bomb and gouge. I mean, it was just hit it as far as you can, hope that it goes straight, and then the whole game becomes a putting contest at that point, because everybody can hit it 300 yards now. And
Mm.
it's been that way ever since.
Mm.
Just like it has in fly fishing. That has stuck, and I'm not involved in golf nearly as much as I was 10 or 15 years ago. But I still see commercials now where guys talk about, well, we moved the center of gravity half a degree here and it's going to give you 5 extra yards. It's like, man, the scores in golf haven't gotten any better, with the advent of these types of clubs in a very similar way that casting has not gotten any better with very exotic materials and tapers and scrim layups.
Well,
I mean, we still
no,
see the same problems.
well, I would actually say casting has got worse as a result of
You're
this.
probably right.
I
You're probably right.
there is a lack of feel there, and because there is a lack of feel, people are using heavier lines, which is absurd when you think about it, because it's not the rod that's the important thing here. Obviously, the fly in the end is very important, and then the leader. But the next important thing is the fly line. The
Yep.
reason for fishing a four weight fly line, for example, is you have more sensitivity, you have better, it's more delicate when you land. And it's more fun actually to fight the fish with a lighter line in between, but it's more about the sensitivity and the ability to fish fine tippets. The reason we use a 12 weight or 11 weight line or even a 10 weight line for tarpon is because we've got bigger flies to turn over. It's basically about the size
Right.
of the fly, the size of the line. Now, if you're four weight line or you're in the States, right, for the trout fishing, most people use a five weight. That's the most popular rod, and I
Yep.
put for a five. So it used to be you would get your five weight line, you go fishing. Five is nice. You can fish quite light tippets on that, and you can fish small flies. But now five weight lines don't weigh a five. Some of them weigh a six.
Right.
Some even might even weigh an eight.
Yeah.
So they've got their five weight rod. They're going, oh, I don't like this as a five weight line. I'm going to put a six weight line on it. Now they might be fishing an eight or even a nine weight. How can you fish how can you fish delicately? What are you going to do? You're going to go, oh, I'm not going to fish dry flies today. Instead, I'm going to fish this 6-inch streamer.
Yeah. Kerry Burkheimer and I used to talk about this, and Kerry was one of the few, and I haven't really paid much attention to how he designates his rods, but he used to rate his rods for 3 line weights, which I thought was very appropriate. But the problem was is that it wasn't accepted by the general public, at least not to the degree that it should have been. But if you took one of Kerry's rods and let's say it was a 5, 6, 7, well, the middle number, the six was sort of like if you had 30 feet outside, that was what felt most comfortable to most people was the six. The 7 was going to overline it a little bit if you were fishing in close, and then you could put a 5 on there if you were going to be fishing 60 or 70 or 80 feet. And we used to talk about that all the time is that it's just weight is all it is. But when it gets to a point where you have to have an unreasonable amount of weight on there or use an unreasonable amount of force to make that bend,
Right.
then then what?
But well, firstly, if you're fishing up close, I wouldn't fish the heavier. But so I grew up with that in the UK. That was standard. It was either two or even three line weights. If it was two,
Yeah,
if
yep,
it was 5, 6, it would be a double taper five or a weight forward six. And if we had set three, often if it was 5, 6, 7, the idea was maybe a shooting taper for the seven. That's basically where that sort of came from. The point is, and I think this is important to understand for most people who are sort of stuck on this, is a rod. I like to imagine a rod has a range of gears, so it can cast just the leader and maybe a couple of
yep,
feet of fly line, but we can also carry 50, 60, maybe more feet of fly line too, right? So we have this, and the reason it does is because the rod bends. So that's by its very nature, we need to be able to cast very close, short distance, medium, long, longer, right? And so
hmm
the line vary. It's not going to be 30 feet of fly line outside the rod tip, which is our AFTM system. So, by the very
Right.
nature of the rod, it can cast a wide variety of lines, like of weight. So, and because it can carry all this variety of weight, because we've got this variety of length, we can also use heavier and lighter lines. It's just going to be it's like having a it's when you've got the line, it's like having a gearbox there. You set all the gears on the rod. If you put a heavier line on it, it's like towing a trailer. That's how I look upon it. If you put a two-way
Mm.
line on it, it's like towing a boat now.
Yep.
So it does change the nature of how it feels. It also changes how it behaves. But to say a rod is optimized to a certain weight isn't true in our game because we need to cast a variety of weight to begin with.
Right. And a variety of architecture in the line itself. I mean, I got so used to I've heard you refer to the really aggressive weight forward type bass bug tapers is I think you call them brick on a string or something like that.
On a string, yeah,
Is
yeah.
that you? Yeah. And we used to jokingly call, because I grew up in golf in the age of the persimmon, the persimmon driver, when a wood was actually a wood and not a metal wood. Um, the head on a persimmon wood wasn't about like that. And nowadays they use these things. We used to jokingly call them toasters on the end of a shaft because it was a big, crazy looking thing about that big, you know. And it's a very similar sort of evolution. But I've gotten to where now you can blame Phil Blackmar for this. You can blame Phil Blackmar for a lot of things, but especially this. Phil was the one who kind of got me started fooling around with distance. Unwillingly, I might add, because at the time I was just more into, when I would go out and have a casting session, it was more about practical accuracy. You know, I need to be able to hit a pie plate at 80 feet under all circumstances, sort of thing. And Phil, he was ate up with this distance thing at the time, and then he can be very convincing. and and so I gradually sort of evolved into the distance thing, and now that's about all I do. But of course, it's funny because I posted a picture of the 10 weight that we just built for Whitney on a Facebook group that used to be my Facebook group. And there were several people on there that were like, why would you use a 10 weight rod with a 5 weight line? I mean, I don't understand the physics of this, and you try to explain it to them and they don't understand unless you go out and have them do it. But my point in that is that, when I ordered my first MED, I hated that line. I still hate that line. But it's the only line that does what it does properly. And the only reason I hate it is because the running line tends to tangle a lot here in Texas. I
Yeah,
guess
it
maybe
is
it's the heat
tropical.
or something.
It is a tropical version.
Uh, and I've tried the Celestial line, and it's a very good line too, but it doesn't last as long as the MED does. In some ways, I actually like the Celestial a little bit better than I do the MED. But my point in all that is that I've gotten now to where my distance rod of choice at the moment is a 7 weight tornado.
Mm,
Or hot torpedo or whatever you want to. For a long time, I threw the 8 until I broke it, and you know that was just because it probably had 500,000 casts behind it, and I just wore it out. But the 8, I threw my longest cast with the 8. I threw 128.3 with that rod twice,
mm,
and I don't throw that far with the 7, but I'm not trying to anymore. I got tennis elbow bad, from casting so much last year.
mm.
But I threw a 124 the other night with the 7. But my point in that is that not about the distance. I've gotten out to where I totally think I could go fish with an 8 weight tornado and a 5 weight MED.
Yes.
And it's such a better fishing line, Paul, because I know this is going to sound kind of corny, but I feel like I can be more artistic with that line.
Mm,
It's like those redfish tapers and bonefish tapers. Don't get me wrong, they're great at what they do, and there's certainly a place for those, and I still use them too. But they just do one thing really good, and that's go fast.
Mm.
And sometimes it's almost uncontrollable how fast that thing shoots because of all of the weight that's out on the very end of that line.
Yeah.
And with that MED, I just feel like I have so much more control over the way that the fly lands and the amount of commotion that is made when the line hits the water. It's just a more refined and artistic way of fishing. And if there was a way that we could get 3M to
Well,
make us a,
well, I
you know,
well, I hope we can. I mean, so the thing about that is, I mean, I don't know about you. I grew up fishing a double. My first line was a double taper,
mm,
and certainly when I started fishing, there were only really two options at that point. There was a double taper, and there was a weight forward line, which was, short, 30 to 40. It wasn't massive. Well, they weren't massively overweight. In fact, they weren't overweight at that time. And then the longer belly lines came in, which is sort of a compromise, and it's a good compromise for me because you
hmm
get to a certain point, and yes, it's possible if you're a very expert practiced distance caster, it is possible to carry 90 feet of double taper line. So all of the line in the air, but it's not really very practical. So you get to a certain point where I think the head length is kind of optimized for the fishing that you're doing. And for me, that is around the length of line that I can maximum length line that I can comfortably pick up, but also the maximum amount of line that I can spake single-handed spay cast. So
mm,
so the med's really good for that. You don't pick it all up because there's a rear taper in there, but you can pick up 50 feet, no
yes,
problem on that, right?
yep,
And that's a good line to for the change for our change direction rolls. But the great thing about having this longer line is you then can put in your presentation casts,
yep,
which is if I'm in a river situation, that's an important cast for me. So I might want to make some sort of maybe we've got trees behind, so I've got to make a spay cast of some sort. But I don't want the line to land fully straight. I might want to put an aerial mend in there. And if I
right,
and if I've got a short weight forward line and that's out beyond the tip, there are some presentations you can do, but there's only like one where you can pick the whole thing up. You can't put
right,
slack into it in the creative way that you can otherwise. So for me, if I would like all of my lines to be long belly weight forward or double taper.
yes,
Having them shorter than that, the only time I would want them shorter is if I'm deep wading and I've got to
mm,
make long casts. But for the sort of fishing that we do, which isn't usually out there at 100 odd foot plus feet,
right,
most of it's
right,
here at 10, 20 feet,
right,
and up. I mean, I often say that the single biggest fault that I see, not just from beginners, but also intermediates and even some expert anglers, is casting too far away.
yep, yep,
And that can be even 30 or 40 feet can be too far because the fish, we want to be fishing under pretty much close to the rod tip, especially in a drifting boat in many situations. So yeah, um, yeah. So I can't remember. I can't remember where we're going. Hell,
well,
I've got to grab a drink.
I got into a bit of a spirited debate. Not really, because I don't, when somebody wants to play tug of war these days, I just don't pick up the rope. But there was a fellow who has a Facebook page dedicated to casting. I can't remember his name, Matthias, maybe. Anyway,
I know,
he
Matthias.
was, yeah, he was throwing 115 or 120, and some guy came on there and said, "Oh yeah, try doing that out of a drift boat," and it's like that's not the point of this exercise. To me, and you guys who compete in that arena, it's sort of a different thing. But for me, the reason that I want to be able to throw 120 feet is that so I can throw 80 when it's blowing 30.
That's what it's all about.
That's what I care about.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong; it's a whole lot of fun to throw 120 feet of line and impress your friends, and you
Yeah, no,
know,
no, no. I'm totally with you. I mean that is what distance casting is really about. It gives you the technique, which allows you to cope with the wind.
yeah,
That's also
yeah,
the advantage of those long belly lines, because if you're casting into a headwind, you often can't shoot line, but you can get the line, they can get what you carry to unroll.
Yes.
So that's where if you've got a 70-foot head, you can make your almost your 80-foot cast, no
Yeah.
problem.
I just felt like, there was a period of time there where I threw the med every night for probably about 6 months. And then I finally wore the coating off of it. And all I had left in my shop, I didn't have another Med 5, and all I had left in my shop was a Celestial Comet, which is it's a fishing line. It's not a distance casting line. And so I thought, well, I'll just go put this 8 weight Celestial Comet back on here. And it shot so fast and hard that and I understand, I was going from, a different type of car to a different type of car, and I shouldn't expect it to handle the same way. But it took me probably 30 minutes to dial back
Mm,
my technique to the point where I felt like I could control that 8 weight weight forward line.
mm,
It's an aggressive weight forward line. The architecture of that line is most of the weight out on the tip. I just thought to myself, how did I fish with these all these years? Because I just feel like all it wants to do is go. It
yeah.
just wants to go. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there's certainly applications where you want that. But that was sort of the turning point for me when I thought, golly, I really would like to have a.
Mm.
I don't know. Have you ever fished with the one that SA has? I think it's called an Infinity.
Yep. Yep.
That seems to me like the closest thing, and it's not really that close to a med, but it's got a slightly longer.
Yeah.
Uh,
I do. I mean, that is actually the one that. So it was interesting. So this was a few years back. I had a friend come over and he was fishing a redfish line. And so I wrote to SA, I wrote to Bruce and I said, I tried this redfish line and I really like it. And they said, well, actually, we've got a line in development. We send this over to you. Because it's basically it's what became the Infinity, because what they found out there was a lot of permit fishing were using the redfish line, and so they changed it around a bit. It's a different tape, and they made it better, made it more applicable. They thought for sort of maybe longer shots. So I started using that, and I like it, and I do have them set up here. But with I know I think it slows the shot down a little bit for me because it's half up. I could
mm,
go half under. People might get this idea that they have faster shots with heavier lines. It doesn't. It just everything just takes longer. I hate to use the word loading, but there is more rod loading, so they have to wait for it to unload, and so it's slower and it's slower through the
yeah,
year. So I really do notice the difference there on the shots. Even just that, even just half up, I feel I immediately notice a difference because I'm so used to taking these
yeah,
shots. So
yeah.
it's all dialed in. So I end up using the bonefish line there, but it is a nice line. It's one of the ones I do recommend.
Okay.
So
The last time we were down at the coast, I tried to find one, and they didn't have one in stock. They were sold out, which was
mm,
unfortunate because I ended up having to buy a more traditional. But I still think, and I think Celestial seems like Steve developed a line that was based upon his fishing line, but it was 120 foot. It was sort of like a hybrid between his competition. I just haven't, I haven't tried it. I think Jimmy Cook may have one actually. Maybe I'll try to swipe one from Jimmy and
I don't
see.
know. I haven't
He
really.
may have one.
I have not tried.
But
Steve isn't sent me
my
any.
point in all that though is that I just would like to have a line with a tropical coating that wasn't just didn't feel like a cannonball on the end of the string
Mm.
because I really enjoy. I totally think I could go down there with a 7 weight rod and that 5 weight med. And I know they make a 7 weight med, and I should probably try that too. But the problem is the coating.
Yeah.
I'd really, really have something that's a little geared more
Well,
toward tropical type.
the bonefish lines from SA they're what I use here in the tropic.
Okay,
I mean, I would like them to be a little bit longer, but they're not like super heavy that are going to get away
not
from you.
horrible.
I
Yeah,
I use them here for all the shots and so on. Yes, it would be nicer if the head was, you know, half as long again,
yeah,
but it's not. But it's still okay, and it's still very fishable, and that's what I use. And otherwise, the Infinity also works. It's just as I say, it's just a little bit heavier. But that the bonefish line is the one I actually recommend for people on the sevens and eights who are going
okay,
to water fishing. And then on the 10, I often put personally, I use the Infinity, but I use the Infinity 9 on
Oh,
that.
do you underline it a little bit? Because it's like
Underline.
a 9.5, really, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
prefer that to the 10.5.
Well, but would you say that some of that, some of that, because we were talking about loading the rod a while ago,
Mm.
there was some fairly, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Some confusing comments. When you did your podcast on wet fly swing and we're talking about sort of the red herring of the rod loading, there was some
Mm.
guys that came on there and was like, is this a joke? Is this guy kidding? Like, you got to load the rod?
All right, I
Um,
didn't read the comments, probably just as
yeah,
well.
yeah. Well, you might not want to, or you might want to. You might get a laugh out of them. I've gotten to where now, after having run a Facebook group of my own for 6 years or however long it was, my skin used to be pretty thin, and then now I just go and I think it's hilarious when people make fun of me for some of the stuff I say
Oh God,
because,
you
you know,
got you cannot be sensitive if you're
no,
online. I learned that
no,
a long time ago. And you cannot definitely don't get involved in any of these petty arguments and just agree with them. But no, I mean
no.
the whole rod loading is. I mean, I did that video called "It's a Red Herring," but we've known that for 25 years,
Well, the
maybe
thing is, though,
even
Paul.
longer. But we've certainly known that in 25 years for Sexyloops.
So
It's
we're talking about lines being overweighted and rods being too stiff, and all of that is true. But
it's not because of rod loading; it's because of feel, and it's
right, but you're right. My point in that was that with a 170 technique, though, you can use that sort of 170 style technique with 10 foot of line out the rod, and then you don't have to worry about the loading.
yeah. So the problem the key problem is people don't have a variable casting arc. They cast from
Yes,
10
right,
to 2. Now, if
right.
all your
Yep,
stroke is 10 to 2 and you have a light line, I mean the rod bend is important, right? It turns rotation at
right.
at the butt into a different path for the rod tip,
Yep,
ideally a straight path. If that isn't enough weight in our 10 to 2, that rod doesn't bend enough, and that's when it domes. So they get big open loops. Put
yep,
a heavier line on, the rod will bend more. And so they do get a tighter loop. So then they're going to go, oh, see, this is rod loading. But what the problem was, it was the 10 to 2. If they were like
right,
11 to 1, they would have got tight loops to begin with.
right,
So
right.
that's the core issue. They don't have a variable casting arc, and they're using too wide a casting arc for the amount of line or the amount of weight they've got outside the rod tip.
And how do you feel about the concept of no stop? Because most of those 10 to 2 guys still want to stop the rod.
All right. So there are a number of ways of looking at that, and this could be this could be a podcast in itself, Andy. Um, and there's a lot of history in there, pretty much right through the Sexy Loops. And I think probably the first guy who really changed that was Rick
Agree.
with the stopless cast, and then there was a lot of research into because I think the idea of the stop was you bend the rod like a catapult, you then stop the rod, it unloads its energy, and the more abrupt you stop the rod, the better the transfer of energy. Not true, as it turns out. All the energy gets out there in a way. That's the first part. So you don't have they found so there was those brick and the string models from Grund in Norway, where they had a brick, the models, but they had it was like a little brick being pulled by a spring and then being pulled, and so they would do two. They would do one where they're pulling it and getting it moving, and suddenly stop, and see how far the brick went, and then the other one simultaneously. But instead of stopping abruptly, it carried on a little bit, and this brick would go further. So it was still giving energy to the brick. So
Right.
when you have a stopless cast, you are still giving it energy through this slow stop. That's part one of this. Part two of this is a guy called Service Edic, and I think he died a couple of years ago, but he came up with his SDM, which is self deceleration mechanism. I always thought it was S and M, but it's not. It's SDM. And the
That's a
idea,
different podcast too, Paul.
the idea is a bit more sexulous. The
Yeah.
idea there is you've got it like a bed spring. You jump down on the bed spring, you get ping back up again. That's
Right.
how I understand this SDM in a way. So the rod's going to unload anyway. It's not going to stay bent. It
Yeah.
doesn't. You just start to decelerate the thing and it unloads. I actually think you get the angle change right. It starts to unload just
It
because
does.
of the pressure and the tip from the force from the tip. So so it's but you do get this idea that, oh look, if you stop harder, you get better results. But what's actually happening, I think, for a lot of people when they're thinking about stopping harder, there's actually like the squeeze stop, for example. If
Hmm.
I if I make, I'll just get a prop here. If I make my squeeze, I exaggerated it. If I squeeze, see how the rod moves, the fly swat the moves forward. So when they're making this hard stop, what is actually happening for I think under certain circumstances is not that they're making an abrupt stop, but they're actually making an abrupt acceleration just prior to the stop, and it's
Yes.
the acceleration that matters. Now, there are some you could say, yes, it's important. We do control the rod tip path a little bit by shaping the loop by leaving the rod tip a little bit higher at some point. But basically, um, yeah, it's another red herring.
I didn't mean for that to descend into chaos there as far as casting goes. But I think it's important. We talk about, a lot of guys, there's a lot of banter about how important the rod is, especially in fly casting. And I've come later, much later to the game than a lot of, especially you and Rick and those guys. But it's really a lot of it is about the line. Um, and the architecture and the length of the line, and I just was curious what your thoughts were on on
Mm.
on the stop list thing as it relates to underweighting, overweighting, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I don't think it relates to underweighting and overweighting. But I think it relates very much to people's idea of rod loading.
Yes, I
Which,
got you.
but there's an interesting point there. You, how important a rod is an interesting. I don't think a rod. We often hear that the better the caster becomes, the less important the rod matters. That you often hear that,
Hmm.
because you can cast anything. But I actually think the better a caster, that's one group of good casters. But there's another group of good casters who it matters even more because you get the feedback and you have. I mean, I can definitely perform better with certain rods than others in
Yes, agree.
taking shots. If you can give me a rod here, and I get customers come here and they bring their rod, and I start making shots, and it's just it is not as good as the rods
Right,
that I usually use.
right.
And so there is definitely a difference in there too. The line matters, the rod matters. Um, so and it's like anything. Yes, you can go fishing with sunglasses that have got scratches on them and you can't hardly see out, but you
Right.
can still catch fish. But isn't it nice to have clear glasses where you can
Right.
actually see the world around
So
you?
you're working with something instead of against it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Something it enhances
Yeah.
it enhances your performance, but also enhances your experience too, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
any car will get you there, but actually, a car that wants to drive in a straight line when you are wanting to drive in a straight line does make it easier than one
Right.
constantly taking you off to the side.
Right. So let's talk about the torpedoes slash tornadoes.
Okay.
What you want to? How do you want to approach that? You want me to talk about the build process, or do you want to
Yeah,
talk about your the development
no,
of
let's
your
let's
your
talk.
side of it? Or?
Yeah, let's go with the build. Let's go with
Okay.
the building aspect of it. So, I think so. Let me start this. Well, you can take this in any way you want, but one of the more obvious things to me between a rod that you build or hopefully other custom rod builders would build at the high quality is in the epoxy. And as I understand it, you can correct me here, as I understand it, to get a really thin, flat finish, you need to apply three, maybe four coats of epoxy sometimes.
Well, some of that depends upon the nature and the characteristics of the epoxy in terms of viscosity and surface tension. The big thing that rod builders don't like, and you can tell when somebody has applied too much epoxy, is you get a football shape on the guides. I mean, that's if you want it to stay flat and thin, multiple thinner coats are better. But a lot of that depends upon the length of the guide wrap. One of the things that I do with the tornadoes, and I don't know that it's necessarily anything that's unique, but a lot of rod builders, there's a weird optical illusion that happens with guide wraps that as the blank diameter decreases, guide wraps of the same length tend to look longer. It's very odd. And so what a lot of rod builders will do is they want them to look, correct. They want them to look the same.
Hmm.
And I don't care about that. Um, because what happens is what you end up doing is you end up making the bigger guides have longer wraps, which means more thread and epoxy, which equals more weight. So I start every one of my guide wraps in front of the guide foot starts somewhere between 8 and 5 turns of thread. I don't adjust for that optical illusion. Now, some people will look at that and they'll go, "Well, that doesn't look like it's symmetrical down the rod." And I go, "I don't care. I don't want to add resin weight. I mean, if you're building an 80-pound class trolling rod, who cares, right? I mean, because that thing weighs 3 pounds anyway, and it's not going to matter if you add a few extra turns of thread or a little bit of extra epoxy. But my point in that is that if you keep your guide wrap short, you have to be much more cognizant of that football shape happening because a longer guide wrap is a lot easier to keep it flat. At least for me, it is.
Mhm.
A longer guide wrap is easier to keep the finish flat and not have that ovality to it. So yes, I would agree with that certainly on fly rods and conventional rods built for bass or walleye or things like that. Yeah,
Which would be one major difference between the manufacturers who are trying to get as many rods out the door as possible.
correct.
Not just because it's four or five times as much work, or three or four times as much work
Right.
going through it, but there's three or four times as much drying time.
Correct. Yeah, they're trying to get it done in 2 coats or less.
Mm.
I mean, um, most of the time they're trying to get it done in 2 coats. There's a lot of people over the last 30 years, it's become very popular to thin your finish with acetone, which you can do. I'm not a proponent of. I don't think it's necessary, but a lot of guys want to thin that finish down to get an even thinner coat. The problem with that is that you can reach a point of diminishing returns where if you add too much solvent to the finish, and it starts to cross link to the point where you still have trapped solvent in the finish, that finish can stay kind of soft. Um, I know a lot of guys that do that though. I mean, a good friend of mine, Mark McKenna up in the Northeast, Mark, I think Mark must mainline acetone like heroin. I mean, he does a 50-50 mix of acetone and finish and Mark gets beautiful results. So it's like I argue with him all the time. I go, look, I don't recommend that to my customers, but I'm not going to argue with you because your rods look fantastic. I mean, they're great. Um, that's not something I've ever done. I tend to come from the camp of if an epoxy is designed correctly, you shouldn't have to do a lot of manipulation to it. I mean, you should be able to put it on the guide wrap in the right amount and then leave it the hell alone.
Mhm.
And it should do what it's supposed to do, and you may have to do a little manual bubble release with some heat or something like that. I
How do you
spent
do
hundreds
that?
of hours. um a lot of guys use a torch, like a little butane torch. They make these little, um it's called a bubble buster. It's a little bottle you can squeeze that you put denatured alcohol in, and it's got a wick, and you can get like a little pinpoint flame.
Oh,
To be honest with you, if I have an errant bubble, I just breathe on it through a straw. The heat of your breath will pop
right,
them.
okay.
You can pop a lot of them.
While it's all still soft and runny, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's still liquid. Now you have to be kind of careful with that because well, we don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but there is an anomaly, a process that you can have called polyamine blush, which epoxy consists of a epoxy resin and a polyamine hardener. And under the right circumstances, usually high humidity and low temperature, when that epoxy cures, it'll produce a substance called amine carbonate, and that amine carbonate will show itself as sort of a greasy, like when the epoxy cures, you'll have like a greasy film on the top of it. And so you have to be careful about, I mean, if it's 35 or 40 degrees in the shop, you don't want to go blowing on it because that increases the chance of the carbon dioxide mixing with the polyamine and creating that amine carbonate. So, just be probably more than your listeners wanted to know
Yeah,
about epoxy,
Fahrenheit,
but,
by the way, not
but
centigrade.
yeah, yeah,
Fahrenheit,
correct.
not
Yeah,
centigrade.
correct. But my point in that is that, um, you know, in my mind, if an epoxy is designed correctly, you shouldn't have to do too much to it to get it to work right. It's really up to the rod builder to understand. And that's why we have different brands of epoxy because some people like it really thick, some people like it really thin. I've always had, even with Threadmaster, I've had two different viscosities, a standard build and a low build or a low viscosity build. Um, and you can certainly thin it with a little bit of acetone if you want it even thinner, but I've never found that to be necessary. I personally do on your rods. It depends. The stripping guides usually get four coats, and then the further you go up the tip, the less need there is for four. Some of the tip guides usually only get, if it's like a four weight or a five weight, they might only get two. What I'm going for when I build a rod is I just want just enough epoxy to cover the ridges of the thread.
Yeah.
That's all I want. You know, Rick Hartman and I have talked about this because I built some tournament rods for him. And, we're just trying to keep the weight down as much as possible. And a lot of guys, are so concerned about, well, we don't want the guides to pull out, you know, a quality epoxy with no color preserver. You're not going to have any of those issues at all. At least you shouldn't.
Mm.
For me, I'm looking for just enough epoxy so that I don't see the ridges of the thread.
Hmm.
Um, and then any more than that is just superfluous
Hmm.
bull crap, really, as we say here in Texas. There's no need for it. But yeah, I think the epoxy work is one place that you can look for, quality work. I will say that, some of the small volume builders, and it's kind of funny because I don't know how to say this without incriminating myself a little bit. I don't really consider myself as much of a custom rod builder as, say, somebody who is intent on doing a lot of the decorative work. Like the heavy thread work and all of the weaves and everything. It's unfortunate that in my mind that's how the general buying public sort of labels a custom rod as to how fancy it can be. And so I've sort of backed away from that label, even though I've made my living in the custom rod building world for a long time. I've not ever really considered myself that kind of a builder. I have this weird philosophy, Paul, that if you've ever watched, I'm assuming that they have these in Malaysia, but like here in America, we have the Food Network, and they have all these gourmet chefs on there that are always having competitions and cooking food. And they talk about how these chefs have a culinary point of view, and maybe your culinary point of view is that you grew up in Malaysia and you're used to Asian food, or you grew up in Mexico, and so your food tends to have a Latin flair to it. And I kind of think that rod builders have that sort of same similar point of view. You can come from the school of thought that a custom rod is heavy, 18 layers of thread and 20 different colors, and you know, sort of like a disco ball in a nightclub, with flashiness all over the place. I've never come from that school of thought. I come much more from Tom Morgan, Jimmy Green, Press Powell, understated elegance, sort of a bamboo type aesthetic,
Mm.
um, and especially when it comes to fly rods, because I just don't feel like, my philosophy has always been that a rod blank is in its most perfect state when there is nothing on it The minute that you start adding stuff to that blank, it takes away from the efficiency of it.
Mm.
And that, I mean, it obviously has to have a handle and a reel seat, so you're not going to get away from that. It obviously has to have some guides and a way of attaching those guides, so you're not going to get away from that. And all of those processes should be executed very, very well. I mean, you don't want a bunch of glue squeezing it out between your reel seat and your
Mm.
handle, and you certainly don't want excess amounts of epoxy or a bunch of stick ups in the epoxy, that look like a dadgum cactus or whatever. But I just believe that no more than what's necessary in order to get the job done, because anything that you do over and above that in terms of decoration is going to affect performance to some degree. Whether it's perceptible or negligible is another argument altogether. And a lot of it depends upon the rod. Again, we go back to an 80-pound class trolling rod. Those types of rods will carry the extra weight without any noticeable degradation in performance, but a 3-weight will not.
Mm.
I mean, you and I have talked about this. You add one extra number 2 recoil on the tip of a 3-weight, you can feel it.
Yep.
You can feel it. A good caster can really feel it. And I've always been of the opinion, and it's part of the reason that I kind of became obsessed with casting was because, and Jimmy used to talk about this all the time. He used to say, look, if you're going to be a rod designer, you got to be a really good caster,
Mm.
to understand what's going on inside that tapered tube.
Mm.
And so, my brother-in-law was out here not too long ago, and he said something about me being obsessed with casting. I go, well, bro, this is my job. Like, I build fly rods, and I need to be able to understand what's going on if we decide we want to change a guide size, or we decide we want to add an extra guide or take away a guide, or, any sort of change could potentially result in um, maybe the improvement in the performance, or maybe it degrades the performance. But you have to be a really good caster to understand that. And I certainly don't put myself on the level of you or Rick or Whitney, uh, or Bill or any of those folks. But I'm decent enough that I can feel the difference between adding an extra guide out on the tip or taking a guide away. Um, but yes, back to your original point, I would say the epoxy work to me is one of the hallmarks of that. Some of those guys like Kerry Burkheimer and Tom Morgan, they do some really good epoxy work. And they're not. I wouldn't say they're high volume builders. I mean, I don't know how many rods Tom was building when he had Tom Morgan Rodsmiths, but I suspect that Kerry's doing a couple thousand rods a year. But I spent so much time over there in the All Star factory, they were doing 10,000 rods a month or however much it was. It was a crazy amount.
Mm.
And I watched those guys, apply finish on over there. And the interesting thing about a high volume factory like that is that I've heard a lot of custom rod builders over the years. We can be sort of an arrogant lot. And I've heard them say things like, well, those rods that come out of that factory look terrible. The finish isn't perfectly level, and they've got a thread stick up here or there. And I used to tell them, I'd go, man, I used to sit there and watch those Asian women build those rods over there at All Star, and they had to build a certain number of rods a day. But I guarantee you, if they only had to build one rod per day, they could outwrap and outfinish you any day of the week. It's just that they were under a time constraint to get certain amount of rods out the door, so they couldn't pay attention to the level of quality that somebody who's not trying to build 10,000 rods a month, can do. So, so anyway, yeah, I try to keep my stuff as basic as possible. I always kind of feel like that, a rod to me, a lot of these guys look at a fishing rod as a platform for their art, and it
Mm.
can certainly be that.
Mm.
But to me, I tend to come of it from a much more utilitarian point of view. To me, I look at a rod as like a hammer, and it's a tool that's designed to do a job.
Yeah.
And I don't know any carpenters who spend all their time decorating the hammer.
No.
I mean, they take it out and build a house with it. And to me, a rod is a tool that you go out and you build an experience with. And that's the whole reason that I got into rod building to begin with, because I was just looking for a way to have a more intimate experience with whatever I was chasing that day, whether it was redfish or trout or bass or whatever. And to me, having a hand in building your own equipment, that's why I like to build my own guitars or build. It's just created a more intimate experience. And to me, whatever your point of view is, if you like all the decorative stuff, I have nothing against that at all. In fact, I mean, I was thankful for all those guys putting 18 layers of thread on their rods because then they needed more epoxy to cover it all. but that's not my style,
Yeah.
and so my style tends to lean more towards the Tom Morgans and the Berkheimers and the Tom Dorseys. And so when you and I sat down and we talked about aesthetically what we wanted to see on the Tornado series, and I approached Jim Trelikas about using that saw blade wrap because it has sort of a whirlwind motif to it.
Yeah.
That to me was the perfect blend of just enough decoration for it to be really interesting and unique.
Yeah.
But there's no extra thread there. Like there was going to be thread there whether it was
Yeah.
a tornado or whether it was a single inlaid wine. There was going to be something there. So we achieved something that's unique aesthetically without affecting or adding anything that wasn't necessary.
Yeah.
So
No,
that
it's perfect. It's a touch of class
I agree.
without the bling, isn't it? You know you've got something special in your hand. It's not got flashing lights that you're telling you so. It's beautiful.
Lars, you call him Viking Lars? Is that
Like it,
Viking
yeah.
Lars? Yeah. He I guess it was a couple of months ago. He and I PM through Facebook quite a bit. And he he texted me and he said, "Oh, those rods look great." I said, "Well, did you see the shark's tooth wrap on there?" And so I sent him a close up and he said, "You have got to be kidding me. I wish I could send all my rods over to you to do that." And I was like, "Well, it's not that hard, man. Surely somebody in Europe could execute that." But we had a good laugh about it. But anyway, so yeah, that's always been sort of my philosophy is, um, and I kind of look at it, Paul, like a lot of these guys, they put hundreds and hundreds of dollars into components and decorating these rods, and then they sort of treat them like a wall ornament or something, like they've
Mm.
got all this work and all this time into it. And so maybe it doesn't get, used to the degree. I have always fancied myself maybe a closet surfer. I used to mess around with some wave riding back in the early 90s when I was young. But I was listening to a surfing podcast the other day with a fella named Sterling Spencer, and he was talking about um, how, the most hardcore guys, they ride a whiteboard with no labels or stickers, and you can always tell that it's being used because that epoxy has turned yellow from being out in the sun for so long. He said that's how you know the true hardcore guys is because their stuff is being used for
Yeah.
what it was intended to do. And that's why I love, Nuno Bettencourt, the famous guitar player for Extreme. No paint on his guitars, bare wood, and there's blood in the wood grain from him playing so much that his fingers would bleed. I think that's fantastic. And it's sort of like you were showing me pictures of your six weight that you've been using for 10 years, and it's like that's what a rod should look like. I mean, it should be
I
dirty and grimy
It was
and
so funny. Somebody wrote to me and he said, "What do you use for your handles?" And I said, "It's just cork." And then he never wrote back to me after that. But that's the color. That's the
yeah,
color it ends up, right?
it looks like it's been set on fire, like charcoal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that's why I was thrilled because I think you and I have a very similar philosophy. Obviously, the aesthetics should be front and center because I mean,
Well,
guys are gonna
people expect it, particularly when they're paying that sort of money, right?
correct. Yeah,
It's got to be a high quality finish. But yeah, I do not like the bling at all. Like, and a lot of rods, so they have these big labels on them too. There's the Orvis
yeah,
one, white, and then so it's that rod, or then there's feather
yeah.
inlay.
That's horrible. I don't know why they
Beautiful.
did that to the Helios. It's a black rod with that big white painted section on the bottom. It's a wonderful rod, but God, is it ugly.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, you know, um, I've just always felt real strongly about that. And part of that is a personality flaw of mine because I probably have some form of attention deficit disorder or something. And I just don't have the patience for that kind of stuff. And in some way I'm jealous of the people who are willing to spend 3 or 4 or 5 days putting all that time into a rod. But I was listening to Skip Fry, the famous surfboard shaper, the other day that was saying, I just want to get some fiberglass on it and go surfing, and it's like that's kind of me. I just want to get some epoxy on there. And yeah, it needs to look good and it needs to be executed well. But the first time I step in Captain Freddie Lynch's boat with a new rod and I slide it into that rod tube, every one of those guides is going to have a scuff mark on the left hand side or the right hand side, depending upon which gunnel I put it under. And so it's like it goes from looking brand new to not looking brand new in less than 3 seconds.
Yeah.
So I just I enjoy the detail work because I enjoy quality, but I'm also understanding that if this is used for what it's meant to be used for, it really needs to be ugly after a year or two.
Yeah,
I
well,
mean,
it amazes me still that people buy rods that are shiny finish, and companies still make them that they've got a big shiny finish. Like, I mean, Sage said it was supposed to be a satin finish, but when you wave that rod up backwards and forwards, it's like a streak of lightning at the right. You get this catch the sun at the right angle.
yeah,
I have spoon.
yeah,
I got one. So what I was in New Zealand and they sent and I used to this used to send me lots of rods. Used to work with them with Sexyloops, and so they sent me a I can't remember what it was TCR6 or whatever, and I usually get a Brillo pad, and I would scuff that to take the mat off, and it had been raining for a
yep.
week, and I hadn't got round to doing it. First day of sunshine, I go out there and I still haven't done the Brillo pad to it. Make a back cast, and this fish spooks. I'm like, how on earth? I mean, it just didn't make any sense. So I gave the rod to somebody there, and I went and stood where the fish was, and I said, wave it backwards and forwards, and it was like those super beams on the front of my
You
truck.
get the
Yeah.
reflection off the finish.
Oh, it was flashing, and that was it. So with that I would I mean I always use matte rods from
Yeah.
the
Even your white finish is fairly matte on the instructor series.
well, it's yeah. I mean, that will spook fish if you go fishing with it. There's no question about it, unless
But
you
you
go
know what,
fishing in
Paul?
a snowstorm.
Well, but you know what? I mean, I think a white blank, because I used to bring in white blanks when I was a CTS distributor back in the old days. And I always liked the white blanks. Now, their white was fairly gloss. It was,
Mm.
you know, but I think a white blank creates less contrast against the sky than a dark blank does, especially if
Or
there's clouds,
yeah,
you
I don't,
know?
I don't know. I can see. I mean, the reason we use it for teaching is so that people can see it. I would.
Yeah.
I think it'd be more obvious. I know people who do fish with them. Oh man, I mean, you can see them fishing a mile away, That's why we all wear camouflage. Or I do anyway nowadays, and I
Yeah.
have done for
Yeah.
decades. And it does make a difference. So and I remember having this conversation with Sage, said, he actually said, Mark Bell actually said, take the Brillo pad to it. I said, oh, that's great. And then, but you invalidate the warranty if you do that.
Of course. Of course. So
Bizarre.
should we talk about spine?
Yeah, okay. Let's talk about spine. I think we're probably going to divide this quite shortly up into two, but we'll see.
I agree.
I
Yeah, I
like these
agree.
long. I do have to say, I like these long discussions. I like the longer format,
Yeah, I do
two,
too.
2 hours, 2 hours 20. Particularly if you're sitting there driving on a long drive, it can be quite
Yes.
good. So I
Yeah.
think, but when we've got to 4 hours, we will definitely have to divide it into two, Andy.
I agree. I agree.
Uh,
So,
yeah, you go.
well, so I guess for anybody who's interested in the philosophy of the tornado build with spine, we build on the straightest axis. Now that's not to say that I don't. Well, I guess maybe I should start with sort of the way I think about spine. And a lot of builders, especially new builders, don't really understand what, at least I don't think they understand what the spine is. The spine, most people think about the spine is that when the blank is manufactured, there's an edge, that spirals around the rod from the cloth being wrapped around the mandrel, and they think that's the spine. That is one cause of the spine, but there are a lot of other factors that influence the spine. And the way that I think about the spine is I don't think of it as a physical thing. I think of it as an effect. It's an invisible effect that is the average of about 8 physical things,
Mm.
maybe 6 physical things. So certainly that edge of that cloth will influence the spine, but so will the straightness of the blank. Any sort of eccentricity or ovality in the blank, in the construction itself, will influence the way that the spine
Mm.
interacts.
Mm.
Um, it to me, it is not a physical thing. It's an effect that's the result or the average of about 5 or 6 different physical things. The cloth edge, the straightness, any eccentricity, ovality. If there's any voids, what we used to refer to as resin translation. If you didn't get if there was an anomaly, a manufacturing anomaly in that pre-preg where maybe there was some air where epoxy didn't get in there, that can affect it. But I don't think of the spine as a physical thing. To me, it's the average of about 6 physical things that produce an effect.
I agree.
And so,
Just jump in there for a sec because
yeah,
there isn't just one overlap that you regularly see. If you're going to get an overlap and you're turning this around a mandrel, that overlap is not going to be straight up. It's going to
it's
be,
not straight. No, it coils around
and if you've got
to some degree.
usually got 4 different sheets, sometimes 5, and you do that and you offset them, you're actually going to have a whole kind of
You're
make.
talking about different carbons when you say 4 or 5
Yeah,
different. Yeah,
yeah,
you're not using a
different cloth.
continuous piece of one,
No,
say IM6. You've got multiple
we got
layups in
four
there.
cloth
Yeah,
overlay, sometimes 5, so
yeah,
different properties. Um, uh, and that's really Alejandro's domain, but that's certainly what we do in order to get the results that we want. So
yeah.
that spine is going to be even less apparent, I think, in that. But the thing is, if you take a piece of wood and you make a piece of dowling,
It's got a spine.
it's got a spine of a sort.
Yeah.
Just the material properties as such, it's going to have some
Any
area.
sort of tubular structure. It's funny because when you and I first started talking about partnering up on this, I sent you what my thoughts were, and I said, "Look, go into a hardware store and grab a piece of PVC off the rack in there, and it's got a spine."
Yeah,
And then I think you may have sent that to Alejandro, and he came back and said the same thing.
yeah.
Like we were saying the same things without knowing that each other was saying it, and I took that as validation of my feelings about the spine because he's an engineer in
Mm.
manufacturing rod blanks. I'm assuming he's got some experience in materials properties engineering or something, way smarter than me. But I've never thought about the spine as a physical thing. To me, it's an effect that's the result of multiple physical things interacting with one another.
Yeah.
And most people don't think of it that way. At least I don't think they do. I don't correspond with enough builders anymore, nor do I really care.
Yeah.
Because to me, I see these guys, that'll spend days getting into arguments on social media about spine and spine placement. And to me, it's like, man, while y'all are sitting out here arguing, I'm going to be fishing.
Yeah. So the question then would be, well, even if it's not a physical thing, but it's a result of a number of things, should you not then be building to it? And I still do not believe that's the case because it's a very because what is there is very small and hard
Yep.
to perceive. I think having the rod, and there's always just like there's going to be some plane or planes of bending or very that is very small. You're also going to have some curvature just
Yep.
because of the way it's made, and that's all that would theoretically going to affect it too. I think no, but having that rod look straight is very important for a lot of people because the first thing
Yep.
they do is pick it up and look at it, and if it goes around a
Yep.
corner, they're not happy. But the other point about this is if the spine really did matter, many of the casts that we make wouldn't be possible because we don't cast through one plane often.
No,
You cast through curved surfaces,
right,
particularly when we make dynamic rolls, or most people don't cast in a plane anyway. Most people are always hooking their cast, but there are
right,
many casts we intentionally do
right.
it, and they would become impossible. So I really think it's like rod loading. It's one of these ideas that people get in their
Yeah.
head and they get stuck with it.
Well, there are two stresses that a rod blink is put under where the spine can become apparent. One is when you're fighting a fish, and the other one is when you're casting. So to me, and this was proven a long time ago, that when the guides are on the bottom of the rod is never going to twist when it's under a load fighting a fish because the pressure from the line pulling those guides downward overrides any sort of twist that you might see from the spine. Now, if we had a rod that we fished with no guides, then the spine might become more apparent. But with a fly rod, the guides are always on the bottom. So we don't have to worry about that. The only thing that we have to worry about is there any effect during casting? And I'm with you in that a rod, especially a fly rod, moves through so many planes during a day of fishing that there's no way. I just don't think that. Here's the way I do it, Paul. And it doesn't matter whether it's my rod or your rod or Rick Hartman's rod or whoever. Every blank you send me gets spined. And if the spine lines up with the straightest axis, wonderful. If it doesn't, then we go with the straightest axis.
By spine, are you going for the plane of bending, or are you going for the spine? Technically, would be the stiffest bit.
Well, it's where it feels, where it rolls
Yeah.
to the stiffest side. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
If that lines up with the straightest axis, and it's not uncommon
Would it?
that
But
it
would it? In theory, not if you had this idea of where you've got a stiff section on the tube, would it not? If you bend 90 degree perpendicular to this.
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking
So
here.
if we have this overlap, this theoretical overlap give it producing this spine on one side of our
Yeah.
tube, and we were to
If
and we
if
were
we
to
built
bend
rods
it,
that way,
and
yep.
we were to bend it, would the plane of bending not be perpendicular to the spine? Like
Well,
the
it should be, but
oh,
but that overlap doesn't go straight up the entire length
oh
of
yeah,
the rod.
I realize
It
that, but
kind of it kind of
people
in
imagine.
theory, yes, I understand what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. So what I do is and I don't spine the butt sections because on a 4-piece fly rod, trying to spine the butt section of a 9 weight, I mean, you might as well, you can't bend it enough to feel the effect. So I usually check the top 2 or 3 sections. And if the spine lines up with the straightest axis, I'm elated, but if it doesn't, I'm not disappointed, because to me, the effect is so negligible. And when I look at somebody like you or Rick or Whitney or whoever cast a rod that maybe doesn't have the tip section, maybe the spine didn't line up with the straightest axis. I mean,
Look, for me, I mean, I don't even have I don't have the unless they're in fact, even torsos, they don't align straight down. I haven't fished with the reel facing down and the rings facing down.
because you
For
you you
30
offset
years.
the first section or two, don't you?
I bottom section with with most of all the rings we've got, like the recoils or whatever. I or snakes when I first
Yeah.
started here, I turn them out by 45 degrees.
On
Really?
all the sections or just the
I,
bottom?
oh,
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 really? Okay.
yeah. So the top
I
three
do the bottom two.
so the top three sections are out. But
Okay.
it doesn't take very much force. If you take this rod and you twist this tip, it does not take very much to turn this rod tip around
Nope.
through 90 degrees either way. I mean, that's going to, I'm sure if we were to study what the rod tip is doing during a cast and high
Yep.
speed, I'm sure you will see it on the side. If I get grooving, and it's always been like that, when I look at the grooving on the rod tip, it's never top and bottom. It's always been out to,
Offset a little
it's
bit.
always been at about 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
Okay, that way. Oh no, and the other, yeah, and the other side here. So it's always
Interesting.
going to do that in a way. Anyway, so I think a lot of stuff happens there, and I really don't think it's important. I think it's more important to have a friction-free cast than to
Yep.
have this idea of some rod that's
Yeah,
spine.
and for any of the rod builders out there who want to chastise me for my views on the spine, I still love you, and you're welcome to build your rod any way you want, and I'm going to build mine any way I want, and at the end of the day, it's not going to matter, but if it makes you feel better to build on the spine, I say build on the
So,
spine,
so we know Sage go with the planar bending. Oh no, sorry, we know Sage go with the straightest rod. The
I think Winston does too. It seemed like I saw a video of them
I would
talking about how I
yeah,
think what they do is they take the curve of the rod
yeah,
and they have it curve up so that the weight of the guides kind of brings it back
okay,
straight a little bit.
all
Is
right.
is
It's definitely going to
um,
be straight. What about the other rod builders? I guess is that something you asked them at that point? It's probably not wasn't a big thing when you interviewed them for rod maker.
um I don't remember discuss. That's been so long ago. I don't remember discussing the spine um with those guys actually. Um
Interesting.
I know at All Star they built on the straightest axis.
Yeah.
I think most factories do because
They'll get the
the
back
first thing
otherwise.
that a guy does when they pick up the rod off the rack is look down to see if it's, if the guides are lined up and it's straight, I mean, that's more of a sales thing or a marketing thing than it is a performance. It's funny because tournament casters are very superstitious folks, as you are aware, and so it's sort of like sometimes, we can use the spine as an example. Under laboratory circumstances, we might find that the spine has no effect, but by God, if they believe it does, let them place it wherever they want. It makes them cast a little better. I mean, um,
Yeah.
and the same with golfers are the same way. I mean, I knew a guy who had to have a certain color head cover on his driver. He wasn't going out to play because without that red head cover, I mean, in guitars, we used to have a joke about, and I was one of these folks. I felt like I didn't ever want anybody cleaning my guitar because the minute that you put some furniture polish on there and removed that dirt and grime, it sounded different. I mean, come on, does it really? Probably not, but I believed it did. So I never cleaned my guitar because of that. So, but as far as the spine goes, again, I mean, I know there's a lot of contention out there amongst the rod builders about how that should be handled. Um, you know, um, my friend Lance Dupree over in Louisiana, he's very vicious in his views on the spine, and he's with us, straightest axis every time. And
Mm,
again, if the spine and the straightest axis lined up, great, we're gonna
mm,
build it like that. But if they don't, I mean, it's not like I'm gonna throw the tip of that rod away until I find one where the straightest axis in the spine. I mean, it's
mm.
just not that big of a deal, I
No.
mean, I don't think it is. And if others do, God bless you. You're certainly welcome to your views, and I'm not going to argue with you on Facebook for 3 days about
Maybe
it.
at one point it did, maybe back in the history, but I certainly don't think it certainly,
Some blanks have two spines.
yeah.
Some of them will have two, I mean, and one will be stronger than the other. So then what do? You pick the strongest one,
Mm.
I mean, well, to me, I mean, if the weaker spine coincided with the straighter axis, I'm going with the weaker one,
Well, yeah, but then
so
the other, I talked to David Norwich about this, a long time ago. Who I don't know if you know David. He was building rods in the UK, and they were really good high
yes,
quality rods.
yes, yeah,
Evolution and Evolution too. He's since sold that business and got out of it. And he contended that if there is a spine, if there is a spine, don't try and put the rings on the opposite side. If there is a stiffest part, don't put the rings against it, because what's going to happen is the rod is going to twist. It doesn't take very much to twist, and it's going to twist through
right.
the bending anyway.
It's going to twist through the anyway. That's right.
If it,
Yep.
but I honestly, Andy, I just don't see it mattering. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to snake roll or make curve casts or all of
Yeah, and
that.
of course, a fly rod is subject to a whole different set of stresses than a lot of other rods are. I mean, you don't take a 100-pound class trolling rod and try to do a snake roll with it. So those guys I could see that are catching, 300-pound tuna, yeah, I might pay more attention to where I put the spine in relation to the guides, but because that's such a tremendous load for long periods of time, you would maybe want to eliminate as much twist as you could while you were fighting a fish for 4 or 5 hours. But
Mm.
for what we do, I'm
Yeah.
with you. I'm glad we agreed on that,
Yeah.
because that can be such a hot topic for people, and I've just never understood.
Yeah.
The rod building community, they like to argue with one another anyway. But I've just never. Again, that's one of those tug of wars where I just don't pick up the rope. I mean, I've got my philosophy on it, and it's worked for me, and it's obviously worked for you. You guys have had the HT series on the market for a decade or more,
Yeah.
and and it's just not. It's just.
And
I
just for the
mean,
record, I did ask you, Andy, 10 years ago if you would build them.
I think it was longer than that,
I
actually.
think it was longer than that. Maybe 12 years.
Yeah, the timing had to be right, and it was perfect. And I remember going down to Corpus, and Phil and I went to this Mexican food restaurant, and I said, I told him I was thinking about selling the business and or selling off the epoxy portion of the business, and he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, Paul's been looking for somebody to build rods for a long time over here in the States," and and he said, "Are you interested in doing that?" And I said, "I think I might be." It's there was a number of reasons that I was interested in that. I still build some rods for Jack and I, and I'd build one for Phil if he wanted one or something like that. Um, but it was kind of a nice cap to a career in product development by coming back to where I started, which was
Mm.
building rods for people. So there was a lot of little things that lined up right, and I was very grateful for the opportunity, and I'm having a ball with it actually. I mean, it's um, the first couple of ones I had to sort of uh, get the muscle memory going again, because it was like, man, I build one rod and then I won't build another one for 6 months or 3 months or however long, but building two a week, you kind of have to get a workflow going, and it had been a long time since I had done that. So it's been a lot of fun. I hope the customers have been pleased. It sounds like that
Oh,
the feedback you've received so far has been good.
been amazed. Absolutely amazed.
And I mean, Lee did such a good job over there in England, and Trev. Um, I wanted to pay homage to that legacy that the
Mm.
two of them have built for you, and it was important for me to to kind of put my own little signature on it. But they set a certain standard for quality, which was very good. In fact, the 7 weight that I have here is it's that white one that had that it sent over here a couple of years ago because it needed some ferrule work on it or something, and then we ended up. But that's a rod. So I actually cast with a rod that Lee built over here right now. So, um, but uh, but yeah, it's been great fun, Paul, and
Yeah,
I look forward to many years of working alongside you with new
great
stuff. Well,
idea.
before we wrap this up, I should we talk about some memories of Mr. Gamble
I think we
before
should
we?
talk. I think we should. Yeah, we should. We've got so much more to talk about. We'll obviously have to get to them quite soon, but we definitely
Yep.
need to talk about our mutual friend Bill,
Yep.
because he was the guy who I was off to meet when we met on the side of the
That
highway.
is correct. Yeah, that is correct. You knew Bill a lot better than I did. I only met Bill face to face that one time in Seguin, October before last, but we stayed in fairly close contact after that meeting. Our paths came very close to crossing when he was working with All Star to redevelop the Austins alongside Don, and we had some interesting conversations about his experience doing that. But you knew Bill a lot better than I did. But I think we all in the casting community were shocked at his death. So he's the same age as me.
He's our age, isn't he? Is he 56, 57, was he?
Yeah, I just turned 56 week before last, and I think he was maybe a few months older than me.
Oh, I'd say yeah. I know we were all in that same category, and we had that Zoom call when you had that meet. That was the last time. I mean, I said to Bill,
I
"We're doing this
I
face," but
remember that.
I was always expecting him to come out here. at some point. I know it's a long way for him to come, so
Yeah,
that never materialized. I mean, I
yeah,
would have known Bill so much better had not had the visa problems with the States all those years back for
yeah.
sure. But we stayed in touch quite regularly, you know, certainly every year or so. We would chat.
I'll tell you a quick story that will tell you all you need to know about Bill. Anybody here in the States is probably familiar with the flooding disaster that we had happen here in Texas. It was a year ago on July 4th in a little community. Well, it was along the Guadalupe River, which is the river that flows an eighth of a mile from my house here. The communities that were hit the hardest were about 20 miles north of me here. It was a horrific flood where something like 137 people were killed, many of whom were young kids, young girls at some summer camps up there. And it made national news. Heck, it might have made world news. It was a horrific situation. It was one of those 1,000-year fluke events where, a weather pattern emerged on a holiday where there were hundreds and hundreds of people along the banks of the river, and it was very, I mean, I live an eighth of a mile from the river here. We watched it come up 37 feet, and unfortunately, they found three victims, that were deceased within half a mile of my house here. One of my coworkers, a young lady, lived up her and her family lived up in the community that was hardest hit about 20 miles north of me called Kerrville. And maybe a day or two after that happened, I got a phone call from Bill, and he said, "Don't you live on the Guadalupe?" I said, "I sure do. That water got about 150 yards from my house here." And he said, "Well, y'all doing okay?" I said, "Oh yeah, we're fine. We're far enough away that we don't have to worry about any of that. I mean, we'd have to have a flood on the order of what happened to Noah's Ark before my house would be in danger." But he said, "Well, do you know anybody who could use some help?" And I said, "Well, there's a young lady that I worked with whose family's entire house was washed away. I mean, like the house is gone. There's a concrete foundation there, but the entire house is gone. And her boyfriend, her fiance's livelihood was selling collectibles, sports collectibles, and his entire inventory of sports collectibles was gone." And Bill said to me, he said, "If I send you $500 to give her, will you match it for me?" And I said, "100% I will." Now, in Bill's defense, this young lady she wouldn't take the money. She wanted to make it back on her own. But Bill was ready to stroke a check for somebody that he had never met before and entrust me to deliver it to the young lady along with my $500 that I told him that I would donate to her.
Oh.
And I think that probably says all you need to know about Bill Gammel right there. I didn't know him all that well, not nearly like you, or certainly not like Rick. I mean, he and Rick have, uh,
He had,
their fingerprint.
he had a really interesting, practical mind. Very bright.
Yeah. Yep.
Bright in that kind of practical way. You know, some people are very bright and you don't understand what they're talking about and they're living in a different world.
Right.
But
Right.
he was like I always like the five essentials, this filter which he's him and his dad are very well known for, and revolutionized our understanding
Yep.
of Lycos and my teaching. But I always liken him to Henry Ford when because I went to the Henry Ford Museum and they had a tractor and it had two sizes of nuts on it. So the entire tractor could be taken apart with one spanner, right?
Yep.
The farmer was sitting on. That kind of practical nature. I just imagined that I just thought it was the same ilk as Bill had. The story I always tell about Bill was it was actually that trip when I went down and visited him. He took me bass fishing, went fishing with Rick as well. I was down there for quite a while. I left my truck there for the winter. And so he took me to some swamp that we were going to fish, and we
Yeah.
carried a canoe over and we paddled across the river and we went up this embankment. We put the canoe into there. I'm up the front of the rod and he's at the back paddling. Made about four strokes and something falls in his lap, right? and he thinks it's a snake, but it's not. It's a fish. It's a bass. I think it was jumped out, landed on him, and it's been raining. The boat's full of the canoe's full of water, and this fish is now swimming around the bottom of the boat. Manages to grab it, holds it. I was looking for the picture for this. Holds it up, gets the picture, puts it back, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, it's a bloody good fish. He's caught a fish, and he hasn't even made a cast yet.
Some kind of a wizard, right?
And not only that, it was the only fish we caught that day.
That's funny.
So yeah.
When I ran into Bill, I felt like I had kind of known him because our paths had come so close to crossing so many times. And I went up to him at that get together and I introduced myself and I said something about All Star and my experience there and I don't think he put two and two together. It was about 30 minutes later he came up to me and he said, "Now tell me again where you and I know each other from." I said, "Bill, I don't think we do know each other." But our paths have come so close to converging on so many occasions. I feel like I do know you. And he said, "Well, come on over here. Let's have a glass of tea together." That's the way we roll down here in Texas. Got to have a glass of sweet tea together. And we spent the rest of the day together talking about rod design and I told him, I said, "Look, I've still got some 9 weights and 12 weights. If you ever want an Austin, you give me a holler." Bill had Bill was unfortunately the victim of some very heavy flooding back when Hurricane Harvey came through here in 2016. He lost a lot of historically important fishing equipment, one of which was a solid carbon fiber spey rod that Jimmy Green had built.
Hmm.
And he had an entire collection of all-star Austins that were washed away. In fact, he told me he lived on some acreage over there in East Texas in Baytown or somewhere over there.
Mhm.
And he said, every now and then I'll walk through my pasture. There's a butt section of a 6 weight sticking up out of the ground, from when it got buried under 2 foot of mud in the flood. And then the ground eroded away just enough to where a little bit of it was sticking out. He told me he had a bunch of really significant artwork, angling artwork that he had, taken possession of over the years through raffles or gifts or whatever. And all of that artwork got washed away. So, Bill had seen some hardship
Mm.
and, I hope his wife and his kids are doing okay over there. Cause that's too young to go. He was one of the good guys.
Oh, incredibly young.
You know,
Just
um,
oh,
Rick and I had a conversation with Rick last week and we both agreed, of course, Rick, he and Rick spend a lot of time in that hockey rink down there or whatever it was, at basketball court or, where they
indoor
were.
hockey. Yeah, like ice hockey, but on rollerblades.
Yeah, it was an ice hockey thing, I think, wasn't
Yeah, with
it?
no.
So he and Rick, they had spent a lot more time together than I obviously ever did with Bill, but um, I was sorry to hear of his passing, and he was one of a kind, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's such a shame, man. It is. You always get that regrets that no, that it's not really regrets. It's like you're missing something from the future that
Yeah,
you could have spent more time doing certain things, and what could have what the fun and the interest that you could have had in
yeah.
your connected lives. I haven't. I only met. I met his. I think. I mean. I think I met his son when his son was first son when his son was a
He would
baby.
have been young.
We would. I think
Uh,
he was still a baby. I think it was
yeah,
just appeared. It was definitely no older than that.
because his youngest son is a year, I think, is a year younger than Jackson, because Jackson's 18, and I think his youngest was 17.
17.
So,
Yeah.
um,
Maybe.
yeah,
Maybe she was pregnant. Okay, I can't. No, I think they. I don't know. It's all. I don't know. I can't really.
yeah,
It was a long
yeah,
time
yeah,
ago. But anyway, but
yeah.
he would send me pictures of them and having grown up and all the fish that they're catching and their hunting prowess.
Yeah,
So
he loved to hunt ducks, and yeah, yeah,
hopefully you can hopefully you can meet them. I'd like to meet them. They'd be welcome to come over here
yeah. I would too.
at some point.
Heck, I'd like to build one of them a rod. I'd like to build them a rod. So, anyway,
Must be really difficult at that age to lose your family.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I haven't heard any more. There was a couple of guys from that casting symposium that went to the funeral service. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get away from responsibilities here, and I think I think it was Rick's birthday that weekend, and he had family coming into town. So unfortunately, the some of us that would have liked to have gone just, and it's a 4 hour drive from me over there, 4.5 hours, and from Rick, Rick is 30, 10 minutes from Mexico down there, so it's like a 6 or 7 hour drive for him probably. But anyway, I hated to hear that, and I know you did too. But
Well, wonderful guy, extremely influential.
yep,
And influential at a very young age, really. I mean,
yep,
I think everybody, because of his such an influence on fly casting, everybody just assumed he was older and than he was, not
yeah.
having met him, uh, but he's very young, our age, for Christ's sake. I mean, that's
He had that casting instructional VHS tape that he had done. I don't know when they did that, but I had a rod builder friend over in Houston named Ellis Mendiola, who has been passed away for some time now. But Ellis gave me a copy of that tape back probably around 2005. And I remember the first time I watched it, I was like, this guy looks like he's 21. I mean, I was expecting him to be, much older, but he's the same age as me.
yeah,
He was probably in his late 20s, early 30s when they did that tape.
yeah.
So
And
anyway,
a brilliant tape. It's a shame. I think he got it converted to digital format, but I don't think it ever appeared.
if mine is still good, I can have it converted. I don't know if it's, those things degrade with age pretty badly, but if it's still if
It
it's
was
still
very
viable,
well
I may
set.
try
I
to.
mean, because that was filmed with the backdrop of the, I don't know, baseball court or whatever it was. And
Yeah, it's like a football field or something like that, where they had the lights. In fact, somebody told me the backstory on that it was like the local high school football field or something, and they got permission to turn the lights on so you could see the line in the air and everything. And
uh,
yeah,
really excellent. And
yeah, yeah,
he actually in order to see everything, I think he put a line on that was a couple of weight. You could put an 8 weight line on a 6 weight rod or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah,
Make
yeah,
one error.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, no, really, really, outstanding guy, really.
yeah. I agree.
Great show.
And not just from a fishing and casting standpoint. He was just a good guy.
It's a really good.
Just a good guy. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, you have anything else we need to discuss, or
Well, we have lots to discuss, but I
we
think
have lots to discuss.
it's getting a bit late your end, and obviously this is already quite a long podcast. So
It's
we'll have,
3 hours. Yeah.
yeah, we'll I think probably edit it down to about 2 hours and 40 minutes or something like that when we take out some of the bits in between, but it will still be a long one. But I think it's
Paul, I'd love to make this a monthly thing or
yeah,
every quarter or something, Uh,
absolutely. Well,
maybe we do one with me and Phil from his living room or
oh,
something.
there are so many stories.
Yeah.
Particularly, you've been in the trade there for so long,
Yeah.
and so many.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. Yeah. Well, I'm thrilled to be partnered up with you on this. And, if anybody ever has any questions or anything, you're always welcome to put them in direct contact with me if they have technical
Absolutely.
things that you don't want to answer or can't answer or whatever. That's
Yeah.
sort of the business model that I'd like to see here is us, working together with each area of expertise that we have and try to bring the best product possible to the market.
Yeah. Great stuff, man.
We got to figure out a way to get together again because 20 something years is too long to,
Yeah.
to not share a boat together at least.
Yeah, absolutely to go fishing, not just casting
Yeah,
next time.
I agree. I agree.
All right, mate. Well, you have a great evening.
You
And
too. It's great chatting with you, and I'm looking forward to doing it again.
all right, have a great one.
All right. I'm going to go eat a piece of pizza for dinner now.
Bye.